reality of the horror and pain and injustice captured. A disturbing documentary can depict an appalling tragedy, present a horrifying philosophical argument, or reveal an aspect of the world in a new and unsettling light. And that is what I've brought you today. 5 disturbing documentaries that were either highly requested or which I found on my own, and all of which will disturb and provoke and unsettle you in some way. I don't believe a ranking is the proper format for this video, especially because I won't really be speaking much on the quality of the documentaries. I'll rather be discussing their contents and their revelatory power. Because of this, and because disturbing documentaries should provoke the viewer, I will be engaging with the ideas presented in the documentary, no matter how controversial they may be, politically, philosophically, or aesthetically. I'll provide some brief content warnings on screen at the beginning of each discussion, and with that said, we can dive into the first deeply disturbing documentary. Orozco the Embalmer. The first stop on today's horrifying tour of disturbing documentaries is 2001's heavily requested nightmarish Mondo film titled Orozco the Embalmer, directed by Kiyotaka Kurisaki, who, just has the weirdest Wikipedia summary I have ever read, designating the man as a photographer who apparently specializes in dead body photography and transitioned into that realm after some time working as a director of adult films. I just really hate that sequence of positions. For those unfamiliar with the Mondo film terminology, this is basically just a documentary that focuses closely on the dark and the salacious. And these films, especially as time has gone on, frequently feature uncensored footage of real death and gore. Orozco the Embalmer is a perfect example of this bloody part of the subgenre, as the movie follows a man named Orozco, an embalmer, as he goes about his work in El Cartucho, which translates to the cartridge. This is one of the most violent and broken areas of Colombia's capital, Bogota. This place is widely seen as a kind of center of urban rot, being filled with trafficking and violence, which predictably leads to a lot of deaths. The embalming business, then, is a thriving one, hence Orozco's presence there. The documentary primarily switches between prolonged, uncut footage of Orozco preparing the dead bodies, and long exploratory shots of the area of El Cartucho, showing ruined buildings, crowds around dead bodies, poverty, homelessness, and basically anything else that showcases the complete decay of this little pocket of Bogota. Orozco's embalming process is crude, generally following a sequence of removing organs, draining blood, cleaning, and stuffing the cavity with random stuff like cloth to maintain the body's shape, before sewing the body up and stuffing the corpse into some dirty clothes. Throughout the process, Orozco is anything but respectful, talking very casually about money, asking a woman on a date, speculating on the wounds of the corpse, etc. He doesn't treat the corpses gently, rather he shoves them around and forces them into whatever position he needs. To be clear, while this might bother some, and may even feel immoral in some respect, for Orozco, it's basically just a job, one that he's just overwhelmingly desensitized to. And it's here I should say that, honestly, this movie is pretty boring. It's composed of just extremely long scenes that aren't really edited for consumption by a viewer, and this isn't helped by the extremely repetitive Latin music that plays throughout. The entire exercise is drab and manages to turn death and our way of treating the dead into a complete banality. But this is kind of on purpose. For Orozco and the people in the area, it seems like death and violence and poverty are just facts of life. Rather than making a spectacle out of violence, this documentary highlights that, for the people embedded in the situations that might otherwise make for an engrossing cinematic experience, the world they occupy is just that, their world. It's normal and mundane. The movie captures this mundaneness by taking violence and death and gore and portraying it blandly. In some ways, I think this enhances the documentary's disturbing power, because it doesn't dress any of this up. It just shows you a dark area of the world and a disturbing occupation in society, and doesn't really offer much in the way of commentary or respect. It just is. And I think that's very different from what we might expect as viewers. We expect death and violence to be framed appropriately. Dramatic music, haunting lighting, editing that accentuates the shock. We expect the cinematic framing to appropriately match the subject matter. We're seeing real bodies chopped up wantonly, and we've been primed to have that accompanied by these dramatic aspects. And when it's portrayed with the same cinematic weight as footage of someone walking down the street, our brains break a little bit. The documentary truly does show a lot that I was very surprised by. We see the discovery of the dead bodies as crowds gather around to stare, and then we see their fully nude corpses being dissected, their organs extracted, and then they're dressed up. There is even an embalming of an infant at one point, where Orozco exhibits a particularly disconcerting disconnect from what he's doing. I mean, it's an infant, and Orozco kind of crudely stuffs cloth up its nose with seemingly no sense for what exactly he's doing. The most viscerally disturbing part of the documentary, surprisingly, wasn't the gore itself, but just how shaky and floppy and jiggly all of the bodies are. In death, there's no muscular contraction and connection that gives everything a sense of arranged rigidity. No, absent that nebulous vital force, we are basically just enclosed sacks of gelatinous meat and viscous fluid. For a few days after watching this movie, it was personally a little hard to experience people as anything more than meat bags with a somewhat presentable external shell. Rather than transcendental subjects, rational beings with a soul, this movie reframes us as temporarily animated biological machines. Once that vitality runs out, what's left behind isn't anything special. And as controversial as this will probably be to say, I found it somewhat hard to condemn Orozco for his lackadaisical way of treating the dead. After all, nobody living was harmed. At the end of the movie, though, Orozco actually dies. Yeah, that was a twist I was not expecting, and sadly, the man himself was not embalmed. In fact, the movie tells us Orozco wasn't even given a grave. Despite the mundane and debatably disrespectful way he approaches his work, Orozco still provided a service to many, many people, and wasn't given the same treatment in turn. It's disappointing. In all, Orozco the Embalmer is a strange documentary, because it is disturbing almost just because of how not disturbing it is. It's how humdrum and routine all of it feels that really unsettled me. It manages to turn a crime and violence-infested area, as well as a gross, shocking profession, into a movie that was really only hard to watch because it was boring. And that fact itself is why this movie is disturbing, because it desensitizes you. It forces you to share in the psychology of the people who live in this area, whose day-to-day life is just this. Basically, this movie disenchants, and the most salient way it did that for me was to remind me that, at the end of the day, we're just a luckily arranged lump of meat. It reminds me of the quote from pessimistic philosopher Peter Vessel-Zapfa's essay, The Last Messiah, quote, "Soon he sees mechanics behind everything, even behind that which he used to hold dear, his beloved's smile. Behind the mask of those we love, those we respect and revere, and even behind our own masks, there lies anatomy, pathetic, fleshy biology, which jiggles and flaps and squirts." Dear Zachary, a letter to a son about his father. Dear Zachary is notorious and is likely one of the most emotionally devastating pieces of media that I have ever witnessed, having cried at least once every time that I've watched it. Dear Zachary depicts a situation that takes an absolutely massive turn towards the end, which I will be spoiling, and yeah, I hate the fact that I'm even using the word spoiling for something like this. Regardless, you're better off watching the documentary and then coming back afterwards, if you haven't already seen it. Dear Zachary, made single-handedly by Kurt Kenny, is at first a documentary about Andrew Bagby, the director's childhood friend. Andrew was a great guy, hilarious, caring, and empathetic. Andrew and Kurt grew up together, and Andrew starred in many of Kurt's amateur movies. The framing of the documentary is that it's basically telling Andrew's son Zachary about his father, and we soon see why that is necessary. Andrew eventually enrolled in medical school, and while there, he began dating a woman named Shirley Turner, a Canadian doctor who's not practicing, and who's about 13 years older than Andrew himself. Shirley was, by all accounts, strange, and many of Andrew's peers seemed to be hesitant about their relationship. She was just off-putting. Andrew switched from surgery to family practice medicine, and began putting distance between himself and Shirley, which agitated her, and she began getting a lot more obsessive. Finally, Andrew broke up with Shirley, and yet she drove nearly 16 hours to come back and visit him. desperately wanting to see him again. Well, at least that's how it appears at first. Unfortunately, Andrew agreed to talk to her, and that night, Andrew was killed. It was obvious to everyone that Shirley did it, and she quickly became the main suspect. However, before anything could really be done about it, Shirley fled back to Canada. It was there that Shirley announced that she was actually pregnant with Andrew's child. Kurt then begins making the documentary about Andrew for Zachary to see when he grows up, to learn about his murdered father. Andrew's parents end up moving to Canada to try and get custody of Zachary, though this doesn't really happen. The courts in Canada were going through a lengthy process trying to extradite her to the United States, and didn't ever force Shirley to relinquish custody of Zachary. They do grant Andrew's parents access to Zachary, which forces his parents to basically hang out with the woman who definitely murdered their son. The worst part of the whole process is that at one point, Shirley is actually put into prison because it was quite obvious to the court that Shirley definitely did murder Andrew. Throughout this time, Zachary lives with the Bagbies. However, in an unreasonable and horrifying turn of events, Shirley receives advice from the goddamn judge about how she can legally get out of jail. And of course, Shirley is released by Judge Gail Welsh, who said, quote, "Dr. Turner's detention is not necessary in the public interest. While the offense with which she is charged is a violent and serious one, it was not directed at the public at large. There is no indication of a psychological disorder that would give concern about potential harm to the public generally, as her crime, while violent, was specific in nature." If you watch the documentary, these words, embodying the most insane and atrocious logic possible, will live in your head rent-free. It's hard to comprehend the complete legal, moral, and human failure that these words both evidence and portend. Eventually, after months of battling, as you have probably guessed, Shirley ends up killing both herself and Zachary by drugging herself and him and jumping into the ocean. It's just awful and tragic, because if the legal institutions had not failed so disastrously, this end would have been avoided. Obviously, this hits everyone extremely hard, especially Andrew's parents, David and Kathleen, who basically had their family eradicated by a single evil person. The two prove their overwhelming amount of strength, however, by turning this injustice into fuel, campaigning to reform the idiotic system which allowed Shirley to be released in the first place. And then the film ends, with Kurt realizing the movie is really for David and Kathleen. I think the thing that stands out to me, and most people who watch this, is the sheer emotional devastation that you will feel when watching. The movie does a great job making you emotionally attached to Andrew, showing home movies at the beginning, and then at choice devastating moments afterwards. We see the bare, unabated grief from Andrew's friends and family, but then watch as everyone seems to find renewed hope when Zachary enters the scene. Their words to Zachary, communicating their excitement to meet him, telling him how great his dad was, fall empty upon Zachary's tragic death at the hands of Shirley. The movie so adeptly communicates the feelings of the people involved that you pretty much can't help but cry and feel unbelievably frustrated and just grieve. I've ugly sobbed every time I've seen this, and I don't expect that to change. The frustration that I mentioned derives from two main sources. The first is just the sheer evil on display from Shirley, obviously, who committed some of the most unthinkably evil possible acts, and for base, selfish reasons. And, of course, the movie situates you right alongside the friends and family of the victims. This isn't the exploitative framing of a typical true crime documentary, so often obsessed with the killers. No, this is a movie that stays with the people who deserve the empathy. The second key source of frustration is just the disastrous failure of the court systems in dealing with Shirley. It's almost comical how much of a bureaucratic nightmare the extradition hearings are. They're so stupid that even Franz Kafka couldn't write something so ridiculous. Meetings to set other meetings, to discuss dates for other meetings, and all the while, an obviously violent criminal is running free. And at critical junctures, people fail to truly account for how wicked Shirley is, just due to how she came across in person. Rather than an obsessive, selfish murderer, the people responsible for her lack of criminal accountability saw her as a mother, a doctor, a harmless person. This is epitomized in the quote from earlier, where Judge Welsh engages in the most baseless, thoughtless, and unethical amateur psychoanalysis, concluding that Shirley's murder of Andrew meant nothing as far as who she was as a person and what kind of acts she still might be capable of. No, according to Welsh, her murder of Andrew was isolated, and because Shirley only ever wanted to kill him, she's fine now. It seems to me to be almost a covert way of victim blaming, as if, in Gail Welsh's understanding, Andrew was uniquely responsible for drawing this kind of behavior out of Shirley, and now that he's gone, she no longer poses any danger and deserves to be released? Like, what? It wasn't Andrew's fault that she murdered him, that she became violent. It's Shirley's fault, and her fault alone, and it's the court system's fault for failing to keep her in check. Even a governmental panel convened afterwards found that the government had critically failed, and that Zachary's death was preventable. Yet this is too little too late, obviously. At the end of the day, this is a deeply tragic human story, and I think the primary way of engaging with Dear Zachary is through empathy and not through detached analysis. This is a movie that wants to show you the humans behind the crime, that wants to show the effects on people when a loved one is lost in the worst of circumstances. I'll call attention here to the fact that 2 charitable funds have been established in honor of Zachary and Andrew. The Dr. Andrew David Bagby Family Medicine Scholarship supports medical students wanting to pursue family medicine and can be donated to online. The other fund is the Dr. Andrew Bagby and son Zachary Andrew Memorial Bursary, which supports medical students who embody Andrew's qualities and who have financial need at the Memorial University of Newfoundland and can, as far as I can tell, only be donated to by physical check. Tickled. The last 2 sections were really heavy, one with tons of gore and death and societal devastation, and one soaked in grief and misery, and the next 2 documentaries will be even worse, so I put Tickled in the middle to break up the horror just a little bit. Tickled is still disturbing, absolutely so, but isn't necessarily on the same level as the others. Tickled follows David Ferrier, a New Zealand journalist specializing in the dark and the strange and the macabre, and co-director Dylan Reeve as they confront the strange hidden world of competitive tickling. It starts when David finds videos where young men are strapped down or otherwise restrained and are subject to ceaseless, agonized tickling from other young men. Their fraught laughter and joyful gasping for breath are enough to cause David, and viewers like myself, to bemusedly laugh at the videos. They seem harmless enough, if quite strange. Interested, David reaches out to the production company, Jane O'Brien Media, and they respond with an aggressive and homophobic email, proclaiming that the company refuses to work with a gay journalist, a fact which is somewhat amusing given the nature of the videos, and that David himself is not gay but bisexual. Regardless, this email doesn't scare David off. Rather, it provokes him to dig deeper. David writes about the tickling videos online, and these pieces make waves, becoming somewhat viral, though this only provokes Jane O'Brien more, and representatives from the company fly to New Zealand to try and intimidate Ferrier and his associates. Despite being somewhat fazed by their threats and bullying, Ferrier and co. decide to follow the representatives back to LA to try and capture the filming process of the tickling competitions, though they are unsuccessful, turned away at the door of the studio. It's here that they start documenting the practices of Jane O'Brien Media. They basically get unaware, financially vulnerable young men to participate in the videos, and then mount harassment campaigns against the participants if they ever try to get the videos taken down. Jane O'Brien Media will dox their information, spread rumors about the supposed homosexuality of the participants. It's clear that, far from a sport, this competitive tickling industry is really a front for what is essentially an exploitative tickle fetish business that maintains itself through secrecy and harassment. Eventually, the leader of Jane O'Brien Media is found to be David D'Amato, a longtime participant in the tickle fetish underground. David was, terrifyingly, a high school assistant principal and was previously jailed for an incident in which he harassed a young college student over tickle videos that the student had made for him. David is, unfortunately, a nepo baby, His father was a lawyer, the founding partner of a very successful law firm actually, and left his son with a massive inheritance, which basically enables David to live in seclusion and operate his Tickle Mafia. The documentary ends on a kind of anticlimactic note, where Ferrier and his team try to locate D'Amato in order to speak with him, as at this point they are basically legal enemies, with all the litigious threats issued from Jane O'Brien Media. They locate D'Amato, but he scurries off quickly after threatening Ferrier with even more legal action. Now, you can go ahead and thank me for being such a generous YouTuber, because despite the fact that I promised 5 disturbing documentaries, I will technically be discussing 6, since some extra context for the Tickled documentary was released in a short follow-up titled The Tickle King. The Tickle King begins with the release of the Tickled documentary at various film festivals, where disruptions keep occurring from disgruntled viewers who seem to be connected to Jane O'Brien Media. Then, Ferrier finds out that he's actually being sued by D'Amato for defamation and emotional distress and invasion of privacy. Alongside these legal threats, one of the original representatives sent from the company, Kevin Clark, engages in a smear campaign in order to discredit the claims of the documentary. Kevin categorically denies the involvement of David D'Amato, yet seems extremely keen to frame Tickled as a baseless hack job motivated by a vendetta against D'Amato. It seems a little strange to so deeply martyr yourself for someone you're absolutely not involved with, but I digress. Luckily for Ferrier, his challenges to D'Amato's lawsuits lead to them being dropped, and as he and his team go to America to promote the documentary more, both Kevin and D'Amato show up to a screening, and D'Amato again tries to threaten the filmmakers, but they are unfazed at this point. The short doc ends there, with things still unresolved. However, shortly after the release, D'Amato himself died of a heart attack at the age of 55, which has, to all appearances, been the end of the tickling saga. As you can see, the disturbance of this film isn't as strong as the previous two, but we still get the oppressive sense of some dark mastermind exploiting vulnerable people, threatening them into silence, and we get that dizzying vertigo from peering into this deep, tickling underworld. And of course, for the ticklish population, of which I promise I am not a part of, well, watching this movie is pretty excruciating. Just the thought of being restrained and relentlessly tickled is horrifying, and I was brought back to the days of being a kid where this was, unfortunately, regularly done to me. Speaking personally, I was a little bit unsatisfied by Tickled. While it's definitely a rabbit hole of a movie, which is always entertaining, I would have preferred that it pull on every single loose thread and fully map out this strange, dark world of competitive endurance tickling. This really wasn't possible though. The continuous legal threats from D'Amato and his underlings, along with the harassment campaigns and just D'Amato's secrecy, meant that the investigation would necessarily leave a few corners unchecked. While we do get a pretty comprehensive outline, it's more of a sketch rather than a detailed picture. Really, the documentary is less of an exploration and more of a personal journey or quest on the part of Ferrier and his co-director Dylan Reeve, as they attempt to uncover D'Amato's identity. And yeah, in that sense, the documentary is a massive success, as it ends with him finally being unmasked. All his unethical and illegal actions were designed to keep him in the shadows, and there's a huge sense of justice associated with him being brought into the light. Thus, the Tickle King follow-up is really the cherry on top, as we get to see even more antics from a desperate D'Amato, who is just incapable of taking accountability. One really important thing this disturbing documentary highlights is that the law isn't some impartial, abstract entity that applies to all of us equally. For the wealthy and secretive and suitably coercive, it's something that can be weaponized. Since the law is not something that everyone has equal access to, it requires enormous amounts of money to actually navigate. So even if the law would theoretically be on your side, this might be moot if your opponent just has more resources than you. The law can be fashioned into a weapon by those wealthy enough and willing to do so. There is an inherent asymmetry in the legal process because it's so deeply moneyed. Tickled reveals this unfortunate reality through its strange subject matter, and is thus, in my book, a suitably disturbing documentary. Now we can get to the truly dark ones. Dominion. For those of you who are unaware, Dominion is a documentary about factory farming, and I will be discussing some of the practices that it shows, as well as engaging with the ethical arguments for animal welfare. Now, I'm guessing that for some of you, the nature and topic of this documentary means you might want to skip this segment for various reasons. Maybe you don't think you're interested, maybe you're worried I'm going to be aggressive and preachy, maybe you're worried what this discussion might make you feel prompted to do, and so on. I completely understand this, and I would encourage you to sit through this segment all the same, because I've tried my hardest to address these concerns. Some encouragement from Nietzsche might help here. In Beyond Good and Evil, when speaking about the potential harm of truthful information, Nietzsche outlines a new definition of strength or courage, saying, quote, that the strength of a spirit would be proportionate to how much of the truth he could withstand, or, to put it more clearly, to what extent he needs it to be thinned out, veiled over, sweetened up, dumbed down, and lied about. As you can probably guess, this documentary is really, really brutal. It's the most violent one on here, the hardest to watch, but definitely one of the most necessary. This film about factory farming and the exploitation of animals is 2 hours long, and it took me nearly 6 hours to fully get through, because I just couldn't take the brutality I was seeing outside of short bursts. I would honestly say that for most people, this documentary is borderline kind of an info hazard. Dominion is a movie that shows hidden footage obtained from the inside of farms and industrialized slaughterhouses in Australia, as well as a few other countries and venues. It documents the horrific practices and torturous conditions that the farmed animals have to go through, covering animals from poultry and pigs and cows to horses, minks, dogs, and even fish and dolphins, and that's not even the full list. And each little segment is alternatingly narrated by recognizable celebrity activists, like Joaquin Phoenix, Rooney Mara, and Sadie Sink. Personally, their voices helped me stay anchored as I bore witness to the massive suffering going on. Now, I'm not going to sit here and read off every single thing the documentary shows. That defeats the point of the documentary and is not really conducive to my overall discussion, though I will discuss the most salient bits here and let you explore on your own. The movie opens by the treatment of factory-farmed pigs, which, speaking personally, summed up the entire documentary in one segment. Pigs are intelligent, sweet, and caring, and their screams sound remarkably similar to a human scream, which makes for a particularly excruciating watch. It's stated that hundreds of millions of pigs are slaughtered each year across the world, and this documentary was made in 2018. A quick Google search reveals the number nowadays to be around 1.5 billion pigs slaughtered per year at time of writing, a number that is pretty much incomprehensibly savage. In the Australian farm setting, many sows, the mother pigs, are kept immobilized in tiny little farrowing crates, where their litters can feed from a neighboring crate. The litter sizes that the industry encourages are extremely taxing on the mother, resulting in a high infancy death rate, which is increased by the sheer filthiness of the disease-ridden pens in which they live. Because of the cramped conditions, it's actually quite common for the mother sows to accidentally crush their babies to death. And, of course, unviable babies will be killed by the staff, where unviable just means they won't yield enough meat, or really just ever be productive enough to justify the farm, quote-unquote, wasting resources on them. The babies also have their tails clipped off without pain relief, and are separated completely from their mothers soon after, where they will likely be slaughtered within a few months. As they wait for death, they are crowded into excrement-filled pens, where cannibalism and disease run rampant, and they exist there with little room to move and little light to see. The tiny cages mean the pigs' muscles deteriorate to the point where they can barely stand, which is made even worse because the pigs are grown to be as huge as possible, putting even more toll on their weakened bodies. And throughout their lives, the pigs are subject to the moods of the workers, who tend to be abusive at worst and uncaring at best. When about to be slaughtered, the innocent creatures will be electrically prodded, beaten, and herded into the kill chambers, where they will meet their end, most often, in a painful gas chamber, followed by being bled out. The exact methods here do vary, but what's common across methodologies is that the pigs are not universally rendered unconscious or unfeeling. Many are killed fully conscious, feeling all that happens to them. The pigs were the most salient creature to me, perhaps because they were shown first, but every segment contained some new atrocity that turned my stomach. The mother cows desperately searching for their children who've been removed from them, and the forceful impregnation that keeps the cows producing milk. The live plucking and shearing and skinning of animals like chickens, sheep, and foxes. What also struck me was the way that many of these animals' very existence is burdensome because of selective breeding and genetic modification. The animals are bred to yield as much product as possible, often meat. Ducks, for example, are kept in large pens that don't have any water. But ducks are semi-aquatic, meaning their bodies are designed to spend large amounts of time floating and swimming, not walking. Their skeletons and muscles and frames simply aren't meant to support their body weights 100% of the time, much less with this extra weight due to the breeding process. Thus, a huge portion of these ducks end up with deformities and disorders that severely impact their quality of life just by being born. That's all I can detail here. The documentary genuinely covers so much information that it would actually be quicker for you to just watch it, rather than listen to me attempt to summarize it, especially because the visual footage adds so much information. I hope that brief summary at least gives you a slight sense of the torturous conditions and painful deaths that these animals are forced to go through. Speaking on my own experience with the documentary, I mentioned earlier that it took me nearly 6 hours to watch this 2-hour film. I just couldn't watch more than 5 or 10 minutes without having to pause it and do something else. The agony that was constantly on display was too much. Additionally, immediately upon finishing the movie, really upon finishing the pig segment, I became vegetarian, and have successfully maintained that choice since, a little over a month at time of recording. I want to speak a little bit more on my own personal experience with this movie because it's pretty illuminating, I think, and might reflect your own experience right now. People have recommended this movie a few times, very vehemently, but I've been scared to watch it. Not because it's brutal, not because I didn't think I could stomach it, but because I knew that, very likely, if I did watch it, I would probably feel compelled to change my behavior. I would feel morally culpable, and that would change my self-image. And as my now vegetarianism shows, I was correct in this estimation. That's an interesting motivation, to deliberately ignore something precisely because you're the type of person that would be affected by it. Not because of disinterest or specific visceral fear, but basically moral avoidance. And this sent me on a bit of a reading frenzy, to try and see if there's any kind of philosophical or psychological precedent for this. And it turns out there is. In fact, this is a widely documented phenomenon. A key concept to understand my moral avoidance is moral wiggle room, which was documented in the paper Exploiting Moral Wiggle Room: Experiments Demonstrating an Illusory Preference for Fairness, by authors Jason Dana, Roberto Weber, and Jason Kwong. These authors, through an experimental game known as the Dictator Game, a description of which is not necessary here, find that when the effects of an agent's actions are uncertain or not transparent, or if their culpability for the action is obscured, agents tend to be much more self-interested. Basically, if there's some uncertainty between actions and outcomes, the subjects seem to grant themselves a little bit of moral wiggle room, and will then be more selfish. Rather than directly caring for a fair or moral outcome, agents are more self-interested and are really more concerned with altruism if it informs a kind of moral self-image, insofar as that self-image grants them utility. Basically, people want to feel good about themselves. This applies to my hesitation to watch Dominion, and really to dive into the field of animal rights, because while I knew where my food came from, and roughly that factory farming was bad, not knowing specifically what was going on and how bad it was, gave me a bit of moral wiggle room to continue behaving in the same way. I could keep eating meat because I didn't specifically know what my consumption was doing. That uncertainty was the wiggle room. Watching Dominion, then, would deprive me of that moral wiggle room. This wanting not to know, as opposed to not wanting to know, is an example of deliberate ignorance, as described in Cass Sunstein's paper, Deliberate Ignorance and Animal Welfare. One of the reasons for this, as he describes in the paper, and as I said earlier, is just that learning about this stuff would definitely have made me change my behavior. I would have felt guilt and shame and moral culpability, so I avoided watching the documentary. The unfortunate thing is that the people who are most likely to deliberately avoid the information are the ones who would most likely be affected by it, as described in Sunstein's paper and in an article titled Willful Ignorance and Moral Behavior. If you're most likely to be affected by the information, that basically means that through empathy or moral consideration or whatever, you'll probably experience some negative feelings upon learning. And you might then envision the psychologically costly transition to a lifestyle that accords with your new ethical feelings. Thus, you have a reason to engage in deliberate ignorance. Unfortunately, as philosopher Nancy Williams puts it in her essay, Affected Ignorance and Animal Suffering, this deliberate ignorance, or affected ignorance as she puts it, is a moral harm. When we have the capacity to investigate, and would likely be better people afterwards, but choose not to, we have done something wrong. I think this all basically gets at why I chose to not watch Dominion for so long. I wanted not to know. I deliberately remained ignorant because I knew I'd have to change after. I wanted to preserve my self-image, preserve my moral wiggle room. But really though, I was failing morally, failing both myself and the animals, whose deaths my consumption of meat led to. Thankfully, my fears about being vegetarian were not well-founded. It hasn't been too expensive, I've lost weight, honestly feel much better physically, and have tried a ton of great new foods. It's been a pretty fun and enlightening journey so far that wasn't anywhere near as hard as I thought it would be. And I'm a really picky eater, so that says something. And if you watch Dominion, or are really just concerned in general, you don't have to go vegan or vegetarian completely. Increments are okay. All in all, Dominion might have been the most impactful movie I've ever seen because it prompted an immediate and comprehensive switch in my life. One that I intend to follow as long as I can, hopefully until death. Thankfully, this hasn't been bad so far, but that doesn't mean getting there was easy. The movie itself was brutal, as were the associated feelings, but I'm glad I watched it, and I hope you'll watch it too. Aside from abstaining from animal products to whatever extent you're able to, there are a couple other ways you can engage with Dominion, its production team, and related projects and ethical theories. Dominion can be most directly supported by donating to the Farm Transparency Project, which gathers footage and tries to expose the exploitation occurring in factory farms. Otherwise, organizations like the Humane League might be worth your consideration, which works through pressuring corporations, among other things. There's also the Farm Sanctuary, which houses rescued farm animals, and the Good Food Institute, which investigates and advocates for alternatives to animal-based foods. There are a ton of others though, so if you don't like any one particular organization, or want to focus on a different area of emphasis, you can take your pick. And now, we can move to the last disturbing documentary. Gaza Fights for Freedom. Gaza Fights for Freedom is a 2019 documentary from director Abby Martin, surrounding the Great March of Return protests held in 2018 and 2019 in the now mostly destroyed Gaza Strip. Now obviously, this film and the events it depicts cannot be separated from the ongoing Gaza genocide, which I'll speak briefly on after, nor can they be separated from the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict broadly, which I'll touch on here, in order for the uninformed to understand the context of the protests, but all I can offer here is a cursory glance at this complicated, frustrating history. There's a ton of good outside reading on the topic if you're interested. The relevant starting point for today is the 1948 Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe. Before this, during what is called the Mandate period after World War I, the British Empire controlled historic Palestine, inhabited by a population that was largely Arab and Muslim. But in the preceding decades, and especially following World War II and the Holocaust, a settler colonial project called Zionism gradually took hold in the Jewish community, leading to a slow colonization of the area. As far as what settler colonialism is, think early American settlers. Anyways, this colonial project of Zionism exploded with the 1948 Nakba, whereby hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled from their homes, either becoming refugees in other lands, or being sequestered into confined areas, like the Gaza Strip. The typical number one will see is about 750,000 Palestinians being forcefully expelled from their homes, in what Israeli historian Ilan Pappé explicitly calls an ethnic cleansing, and a planned one at that. Now, as is sensible, these Palestinians wanted to return to their homelands, and the idea of the right of return was formulated, which is just that there's a moral right for expelled or occupied Palestinians to be able to return to their pre-colonial homes. And this was made into international law with UN Resolution 194, which solidified the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Despite this, Israel has historically denied this right universally, and continues to do so. The other important part of the tragic context of this documentary concerns the Gaza Strip. Governed in various forms by Egypt since 1948, the Gaza Strip was seized by Israel in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, and from there has become what scholars like Ilan Pappé call a prison. Surrounded by barbed wire and military checkpoints, with the seas patrolled by Israel's navy, the populace subject to frequent occupier violence, and resource distribution under the strict discretion of Israeli planning, the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated places on Earth, has been widely recognized as a persistent humanitarian crisis, and one which has been explicitly called a concentration camp by scholars. In fact, multiple UN reports, one in 2012 and one in 2017, which I will link in the description, have forecasted that the Gaza Strip would be uninhabitable by 2020. The Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip is widely denounced as an illegal occupation under international law, and is just obviously immoral. Well, in 2018, a series of overwhelmingly peaceful protests began, partially inspired by Palestinian journalist Ahmed Abu Artema, who saw birds flying around, which made him similarly desire such freedom. Quote, "On that day in December, as I watched the birds fly over the border I could not cross, I found myself thinking how much smarter birds and animals are than people. They harmonize with nature, instead of erecting walls. Later that day, I wondered on Facebook what would happen if a man acted like a bird and crossed that fence. Why would Israeli soldiers shoot at him as if he is committing a crime?" I wrote. The idea of the protests was for the Gazans to venture close to the Gaza-Israel border and peacefully demand the aforementioned right of return, and as we will see, it ended in disaster. This movie, Gaza Fights for Freedom, covers these protests, in the midst of the Gazans and eventual gunfire and chemical attacks. It opens showing the devastation of Gaza, the terrible economic state of the society, and the complete lack of hope or opportunity for the occupied people. The unemployment rate is extraordinarily high, resources are appallingly scarce, and there's just a climate of fear and resignation. That is, until the protests for the right of return, which galvanize and reinvigorate the people, hoping that they can peacefully protest their way into Israeli recognition of this internationally decreed right. Unfortunately, these protests were met with violence from the Israeli military. Snipers shot at unarmed protesters, chemical irritants were deployed, and yet the Palestinians continued protesting, almost unflinchingly. By the end, though, over 200 Palestinians were killed. In the words of a 2019 UN report on the protests, quote, "The Israeli security forces killed and maimed Palestinian demonstrators who did not pose an imminent threat of death or serious injury to others when they were shot, nor were they directly participating in hostilities." The mention of hostilities there is something that I'll touch on later, but it will suffice to say now that of the tens of thousands who participated in the protests, only a tiny minority engaged in any amount of violence, and that violence was overwhelmingly not meaningful. The most clearly illegal part of the violent suppression of the protests comes from the killing and wounding of protected groups like children, the disabled, journalists, and medics, many of whom were deliberately targeted despite obviously posing no threat. Around 46 children were murdered, and from the other protected groups, the documentary particularly hones in on the killing of Palestinian paramedic Razan al-Najjar, who was volunteering to evacuate the wounded protesters when she was hit and killed as Israeli soldiers fired upon her group. She and the other medics were clearly identified as medics and always drew attention to their presence and status. This killing sparked international outrage, and the documentary discusses the disgusting information spread by the IDF, where they released a video in which it appears that Razan is claiming to be acting as a human shield. Basically that she put herself in harm's way to generate outrage. However, the IDF deliberately cut out the context of the quote, where Razan in full states something like, "I am here on the front lines, serving as a human shield, to protect and serve the wounded on the front lines." The movie ends pessimistically, saying that Israel needs to face justice for its denial of the right of return, and for the clear atrocities at these border protests. Yet the country enjoys persistent US protection, and likely won't receive any repercussions. This documentary is deeply important, especially considering the current genocide taking place in Gaza. To date, over 70,000 Gazans have been killed by Israeli forces, tens of thousands of those being children, almost all of them being completely innocent, and many experts point out that these numbers are almost certainly a massive underestimate. There are probably a ton of bodies under rubble from the completely destroyed landscape, for example. The usual framing of this genocide, as it's been called by various international human rights organizations, is that it's basically an exaggerated response to the attacks on October 7th of 2023 by Hamas, the ruling party in Gaza. Many, especially Americans, are thus primed to ignore talk of genocide and accept Israel's narrative of the quote-unquote war as just a reaction to this attack. The obvious problem with this is that it ignores history. The Israel-Palestine conflict did not begin on October 7th. There's over 100 years of colonization, occupation, and denial of human rights that must be recognized in order to properly understand the situation today. And this documentary does a great job to contribute to that. Many will ask the Gazan people, why not protest peacefully? This documentary should quell all concerns about that. Here, the Gazans did protest peacefully, and they were met with cruel, indiscriminate slaughter. Of course, I mentioned that there was violence on the side of the Palestinians, such as rocks and even Molotov cocktails being thrown. As Ahmed Abu Artema writes, quote, "When a movement becomes this large, attracting what we estimate to be as many as 200,000 people on Fridays, it cannot be completely controlled. So a few people engaging in violence does not invalidate the entire march, nor does it justify the slaughter, especially because the casualties to the Israeli forces are negligible, the most significant of which was a single soldier's death, compared to the hundreds dead and wounded in Gaza. And even then, UN international law has repeatedly affirmed the right of occupied peoples to resist, even through armed struggle." The quote from earlier should be remembered here, that the people killed were not engaging in violence. The discourse surrounding the Israel-Palestine conflict, due to the nature of the occupation, is almost completely mediated through Israeli channels. Too often, we only hear about the Palestinians through voices which are not their own, which fundamentally disregard their aims and lives, and which are all too happy to distort their messages, as can be seen with Razan al-Najjar. This movie helps to push back against this by centering Palestinian activists and victims and civilians throughout. The movie largely lets them speak for themselves, and does its best to support their own voices. This documentary is disturbing for many reasons. For one, we just blatantly see the unpalatable injustice done to very vulnerable members of society. We see unarmed people get shot, children get bombed and gassed, and numerous amputations following the sniper bullets. In fact, it's been established that, aside from the kill shots, many of the snipers were deliberately targeting knees and lower legs, which basically guarantees permanent disability and possibly amputation. I think it's also disturbing, aside from the obviously terrible facts of the occupation, because this was the one way in which the Gazans were able to find hope through a peaceful protest, and it was met with violent repression. And we know that rather than getting better, the situation just got even more hopeless. Given the current genocide, it's unclear how many, if any, of the people shown in the documentary are even alive anymore. Ahmed Abu Artema, for example, still lives today, though many in his family were killed by an Israeli airstrike soon after October 7th. Gaza Fights for Freedom is an excellent documentary that does a great job of giving a voice to the normally voiceless, and displaces the focal point of historical discussion of the Israel-Palestine conflict from the past few years, revealing a greater history of repression and slaughter. It's a documentary that, while internally dark, hopeless, and deeply frustrating, is made even worse with the current genocidal context. Anyone wanting to learn about the conflict, and especially anyone who wants to hear from first-hand sources, should watch this documentary. It's free on YouTube. There are a couple ways to help the overall cause. You can donate directly to Abby Martin's Empire Files series for her investigative journalism and advocacy. For direct Palestinian relief, the most clear choice is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which directly supports Gazans and Palestinians in other areas. One can also donate to the... Maybe you drank some infected water. Maybe you ate some infected food. Something may have bitten you. You could have brushed up against the wrong object, or even just gone swimming in the wrong body of water. And now something else is on you or in you, and it doesn't belong there. It could be crawling invisibly along your skin, looking for the perfect patch to rip into. It could be moving imperceptibly inside you, searching for the most nutritious feeding place. Maybe it's in your bloodstream, or hijacking your immune system. Or it could even be in your brain, subtly causing your personality to shift, changing who you are at a fundamental level. This is why parasites are so scary. You get them so innocuously. Parasites are often small, and their ways of finding you and getting a hold of you don't cause a stir. There's normally no large event. And before you know it, they've infested you, burrowed through your flesh and swam in your blood. They've invaded you and changed you, and you probably didn't notice. Worse, in some cases, they can be the cause of your death. And even outside of strictly what a parasite can do to you, just the mere sight of a parasite is often enough to send our brains into an uncontrollable panic of fear and disgust. Evolution has hardwired our brains for revulsion at the sight of things like leeches and ticks, as well as the carriers of parasites, like rotten food and animal excrement. Thus, parasites are a ripe topic for the genre of horror, specifically the visual medium of film. And many movies have, in fact, centered themselves on these invasive creatures, either on the ones we know, or ones that our minds conjure into reality. And they do this because parasites offer a specific and unique thematic underpinning. When parasites are featured in a movie, we can often be looking at some theme surrounding invasion, infestation, penetration, siphoning off of resources, greed, and leeching. That is what we will be looking at today. We will be looking through representative examples of films that explore the monsters inside us and on us. We will be exploring not just the parasites featured, but also what the movie itself is trying to say thematically. And I will try to connect these movies, when relevant, to real-world examples of parasites, because as we will see, this scientifically neglected group of creatures includes some truly strange, highly evolved, fascinating monsters that will send shivers down your spine. I've recently fallen in love with these creatures, and I can't wait to share that love with you all. This video won't be a ranking. While I will offer brief thoughts on quality, and give a little tier list at the end, the focus of this video won't strictly be critical appraisal, but more of a thematic, parasite-focused excursion. We will be surveying movies to explore the aforementioned topics. And while I have a lot of movies for us to go through today, there are definitely more that I didn't and couldn't include. Feel free to share your own thoughts on the many more parasite-focused movies out there. Every fact from parasitology has been sourced from either a published book, a textbook, or a scientific paper. All sources will be shown on screen now and listed in the description, so I encourage the interested viewer to do further investigation on their own. Parasite Rex by Carl Zimmer was particularly helpful for this video, and will probably be the best next place to look. I will overwhelmingly be discussing the parasites as fascinating biological subjects, talking about their evolution, life cycles, and adaptations. While interesting, the reality is that for most of the world, parasites are much more than simple curiosities. They are terrifying carriers of death and disease and pain. This fact is essential to truly understand what parasites are, and many of the movies today have powerful real-world themes, so I'll be listing some useful organizations towards the end of the video. Lastly, if you enjoy videos like this, I would heavily appreciate a like and subscription to my channel. I primarily do videos on philosophy and dark fiction, and try to offer thoughtful and careful critical appraisals of the media that I review. With that said, let's dive into the world of parasites, the monsters inside us. What is a parasite? Your first question might be, what exactly is a parasite? And further, what counts for this video? Well, that's a great question, and it's not exactly easy to answer. A parasite is just something that parasitizes another creature, called the host. To parasitize means to live at the expense of or harm the host. Quote, Parasites may cause mechanical injury, such as boring a hole into the host, or digging into its skin or other tissues, stimulate a damaging inflammatory or immune response, or simply rob the host of nutrition. Most parasites inflict a combination of these conditions on their hosts. For today's video, we will be mostly focusing on the creatures that have been traditionally considered under the discipline of parasitology. And despite the fact that many strains of bacteria, viruses, and fungi fit the definition of a parasite, these have generally been studied in other disciplines like bacteriology, medicine, virology, and mycology, while parasitology, for a variety of reasons, came to study a stricter set of creatures. I adhere to this somewhat arbitrary delineation today because if I tried to include every virus and bacteria-based movie, I'd simply never get to discuss what I actually want to discuss. While a parasitic fungus or two might show up here, overwhelmingly, the parasites discussed here will be eukaryotic protozoa and animals that parasitize other animals, not prokaryotics like bacteria or genetic replicators like viruses, and not parasites of plants. In case it's been a while for you since 9th grade biology, eukaryotes are distinguished from prokaryotic bacteria by having a membrane-bound nucleus where DNA is stored in distinct chromosomes. More definitions and ideas will come as we continue discussing, but this will be enough for now, as we turn to the movies themselves. Alien. I'll bet that upon seeing the video and listening to my introductory discussion, a majority of you immediately thought of Alien, Ridley Scott's 1979 sci-fi horror masterpiece about a mining ship that makes a stop on a dark, rocky, lifeless-looking planet and comes into contact with a terrifying biomechanical creature called the Xenomorph. It's one of the most famous and critically acclaimed horror movies of all time, and its endoparasitoid monster has become a staple of popular culture. Alien is basically the quintessential parasite horror movie, and it's a great place to start our discussion. We will spend a good bit of time here because Alien embodies a lot of the strangeness that parasitic creatures have to offer. The xenomorph featured in the movie, as I just discussed, is an endoparasitoid. There are two important classifiers here, the prefix endo and the suffix oid. Endo means within. An endoparasite is a creature that parasitizes the host from inside, from within, like a tapeworm, while an ectoparasite does the same from the outside, like a tick. And a parasitoid is a creature that parasitizes and eventually kills the host in its immature stages, but is generally free-living in the adult stages. Despite this slight difference, parasitoids are often still considered parasites because, while the adults do not actively parasitize anything, they do engage in host finding and dispersal. We can see this in the xenomorph's life cycle. On the planet where the mining ship, the Nostromo, lands, there lies a massive, circular, and derelict spaceship where an expeditional crew goes to explore. Inside, they come upon a chamber full of large, tough, fleshy eggs called ovomorphs that seem to open in the presence of a person. Kane, a member of the expedition, is attacked when a spider-like facehugger launches itself out of the egg and attaches to his face. It wraps its tail around his throat and its arms strongly grip his face, simultaneously inducing a temporary coma in him with some kind of chemical sedative. It inserts a proboscis down Kane's throat, supplying him with oxygen, and most importantly, creates an embryo within Kane. This creature cannot be easily removed because it will asphyxiate the host in defense, and has acidic blood which can hurt the host. However, the facehugger will soon die regardless, as it is merely an intermediate stage of the xenomorph life form. Once the embryo is developing in Kane, the facehugger detaches and naturally dies, and Kane is able to get up, walk around, and eat food. However, Kane is not safe. Inside him, a fetal xenomorph is gestating and parasitizing him, using his body to grow and assimilating portions of his DNA. And when it's ready, in a mere matter of hours, it violently bursts through Kane's chest, killing him. And while the life cycle depicted in the movie ends there, we know that outside of this, there exists a queen xenomorph which lays the eggs containing the facehuggers, making the xenomorphs resemble ants in societal structure. Additionally, in a cutscene from the movie and in the novelization, there is a horrifying scene where a reproductive process is featured that does not require a queen, called egg morphing. The lone xenomorph essentially uses the flesh of its victims as a soup of matter, which, through chemical secretions, is transmuted into an ovomorph, where the cycle can then repeat. There are so many things to comment on here that I barely even know where to start. First, let's discuss the life cycle. I've always found the life cycle of the xenomorph to be bizarre and overcomplicated and unrealistic. First there's the egg, then the facehugger, then the chestburster, which assimilated host DNA, then the full alien, and sometimes a queen will get mixed in there somewhere. The societal caste structure itself is reflected in real-world animals like ants and bees, but otherwise, things like the complicated multi-stage process, and the fact that the intermediate form, the actual child of the queen, the facehugger, looks nothing like the other traditional forms, these always struck me as cool, sure, but overcomplicated and strange. As I've now learned, however, something key about parasites is that many of them actually do have similar, complicated, and highly specific life cycles, where the children don't always look like the parents. One example is the species Dicrocelium dendriticum, commonly known as the lancet liver fluke. These are tiny little flatworms that primarily infect the bile ducts of larger livestock, like sheep and cows, and have a very complicated life cycle. Using a sheep host as an example, the adult starts off in the bile duct. The flukes lay eggs there, which are then dispelled in the sheep's feces. Snails will eat the eggs, where they are then transported to the intestine and then hatch. What emerges is a little hairy thing called a miracidium. This miracidium drills through the gut's wall and settles itself into the digestive gland, where it will then fully morph into a cyst, called the mother sporocyst. Weirdly, the mother sporocyst produces another cyst called the daughter sporocyst. The daughter sporocysts then hatch little tailed creatures called cercariae. These little guys travel to the snail's lung, or make it to the snail's external surface, where they irritate the snail and cause it to secrete a mucousy substance. These cercariae get trapped in balls of this slime, which are either expelled from inside or just naturally deposited as the snail moves. Either way, there are now a bunch of slime balls containing a bunch of cercariae, awaiting a second intermediate host. Luckily, these slime balls are a delicacy to ants, who swallow them wholeheartedly. Within the ant, the cercariae once again become cysts, called metacercariae, and are now ready to be taken back into a sheep. How do they get there? Well, this species has one last dastardly trick. A couple of these larval flukes will travel to the ant's brain and become cysts there, inducing a startling behavioral change in the ant, a form of mind control. In the evening, the ants will be compelled to climb onto the tops of blades of grass and other plants, and their mandibles will seize suddenly, causing them to grip the vegetation that they've climbed onto. This is, of course, to increase the chances that a grazing sheep or cow or whatever will happen along and eat that plant with the ant, and thus become infected with the lancet flukes, which finally develop once in the bile duct of the animal host. After about 6 weeks, the lancet flukes will have matured, and a month after that, they reproduce, starting the process over. That was exhausting, right? Seems way too complicated. I mean, there are 3 hosts, made up of a final host and 2 intermediate hosts. And not only that, there are vastly different forms along the way. The fluke is different from the metacercaria, which is different from the cercaria, which is different from the daughter sporocyst, which differs from the mother sporocyst, which differs from the miracidium, and so on. In fact, the lancet fluke's life cycle makes the xenomorphs look remarkably simplistic, doesn't it? So the xenomorph's overall multi-stage transfigurative life cycle is grounded in real parasitism. But what about the stranger aspects of the xenomorph? What about the neurological effects that the facehugger has on the human host, putting it to sleep and making it impossible for them to resist, as well as the violent chest bursting of the young final form of the xeno? Well, this kind of thing can also be seen in real-life parasites, specifically a parasitoid, known as Ampulex compressa, the jewel wasp, named for its beautiful, vibrantly colored exterior. Despite its glamorous appearance, this creature exhibits some truly dark and horrifying behavior that greatly resembles the xenomorphs. Jewel wasps parasitize cockroaches. The female wasp will find one for her use, but the cockroach can fight her off, flail around, kick its legs. Thus, the first thing the female jewel wasp does is disable its ability to fight back. With the sting to the nerve cluster in the roach's thorax, venom is injected that temporarily paralyzes the roach. Now subdued, the roach can't fight back, and the jewel wasp settles in for a more precise sting. An adept neurosurgeon, she searches for and finds a precise part of the roach's brain using very sensitive receptors on the stinger that, when the receptors detect the very specific pressure and tension of the precise cluster of the brain that the wasp wants, she immediately injects a dopamine-containing venom. This venom, in short, deactivates the roach's fight or flight responses, along with its decision-making ability, while also compelling the roach to groom itself. It will pick off spores or maybe even other tiny parasites. Basically, it sterilizes itself, and this is necessary for the wasp's eventual plan. After extensive grooming, the roach becomes sluggish. It doesn't react as the wasp proceeds to eat its antenna, still doesn't react as the wasp leaves for a brief time to find a burrow, and only finally moves when the wasp returns and leads it by its antenna to the burrow. She walks it quite literally like a dog. The cockroach moves zombie-like in response to her tugs. It is incapable of doing anything else. Without the cockroach's decision-making ability, Ampulex compressa makes decisions for it. Then, in the burrow, the wasp lays an egg on the cockroach and covers up the entrance, interring the roach with her newly laid egg. The egg hatches, and the larva will make its way into the cockroach by chewing a hole through it. Inside, it parasitizes the cockroach further by eating all of its organs, eventually killing it. Then it readies a cocoon in the corpse of the roach, grows, and emerges from the cocoon as a fully grown Ampulex compressa wasp. And finally, cementing the xenomorph comparison, the adult jewel wasp breaks through the roach's body, basically chest bursting it, and goes on to the rest of its life. And even cooler, some other parasitoid wasps take it even further, like the species Cotesia congregata, which injects a self-synthesized virus into its caterpillar host in order to dampen its immune system. So the facehugger's pharmaceutical skills, as well as the chestburster's violent emergence method, are shared by parasitoid wasps, like Ampulex compressa and Cotesia congregata. The xenomorph's most potent skill, however, is its ability to integrate host DNA into itself through horizontal gene transfer in the midst of gestation. The xenomorph does this to better adapt itself to the eventual predation of the host species. Horizontal gene transfer isn't something extremely common in eukaryotes, but there is emerging, though far from settled science, gesturing to the idea that Plasmodium vivax, one of the species of the genus Plasmodium, which causes malaria, may have engaged in horizontal gene transfer with humanity. The evolutionary relationship between host and parasite can be likened to that of an arms race. Hosts slowly adapt to be able to defend against the parasite, maybe through a strengthened immune system. But parasites are adapting too, slowly getting better at evading the immune system, and finding new ways to propagate. And some scientists argue Plasmodium vivax may have incorporated human DNA in order to better respond to the immune system, thus potentially having a higher chance at evading future adaptations against malaria. Horizontal gene transfer is a potent evolutionary shortcut. You skip the slow, bitter arms race and directly incorporate DNA from the host to level the playing field, which is exactly what the xenomorph does. I hope you're getting the sense now that just like xenomorphs, many parasites are similarly highly evolved and adapted. While their life cycles may seem bizarre and overcomplicated, they still work very well, and they are often accompanied by hyper-specific and powerful adaptations. What thematic role does the parasitic xenomorph play in Alien? As I said in the introduction, parasites often contribute to a theme surrounding invasion and penetration, as well as siphoning of resources and leeching. For Alien, invasion and penetration is key. The design of the xenomorphs is quite telling. The underside of the facehugger is clearly made to resemble female genitalia, and the insertion of a phallic proboscis, as well as the eventual chest bursting, is evocative of sexual reproduction, albeit a violent, perverse version. And the fully grown xenomorph itself has a second inner mouth, with which it uses to stab and pierce and penetrate. The xenomorph, designed by artist H.R. Giger, has inherently sexual undertones, and it evokes a clear fear of penetration. Commentary on the film from both critics and the filmmakers themselves has supported the idea that the xenomorph is specifically made to reverse the fear of penetration and sexual violence onto men, rather than women who are overwhelmingly the targets of such violence in reality and in the horror genre. Kane, a man, is the only person in the movie to be facehugged. He is penetrated by the facehugger and made to give birth to a creature that he couldn't possibly recognize as his own were he to live through the process, even though it shares his DNA. Alien uses the vehicle of parasitism and its associated undertones of invasion and penetration to turn the fear of sexual violence, generally against women, back onto men. Alien turns sex into horror, and it does it very well. The ovomorphs and facehuggers are truly some of the most revolting creatures I've ever seen in a movie. Like, I can barely even look at the facehugger without cringing in disgust. Search facehugger proboscis on Google and try not to immediately gouge your eyes out. It's horrifying. Alien is a great movie, has an extremely fascinating parasite with excellent real-world parallels, and uses its parasite to develop a harrowing theme. The Bay. A more straightforward parasitic horror movie is 2012's The Bay, directed by Barry Levinson. This is a pretty solid found footage horror movie that marries some great body horror with interesting social commentary. It's a bit rough around the edges, but has a lot of genuinely creepy moments, and a few of the scenes left me frantically scratching myself, afraid that I had something on me. It's set in the town of Claridge, Maryland, on the Chesapeake Bay. A chicken farm nearby has been dumping the mass of chicken excrement directly into the water, which unfortunately contains a lot of the toxins and chemicals and hormones that are used to grow the chickens. This results in a mutation occurring within the real species of tongue-eating isopods, Cymothoa exigua. This is a parasitic crustacean that parasitizes fish. They enter through the gills, and the females go into the mouth, restrict blood flow to the tongue, causing it to fall off, where they will then literally replace the fish's tongue. The fish is able to use this new tongue largely as it otherwise would, though the parasitic tongue feeds on the fish's blood and mucus, causing malnourishment in the fish. Anyways, the isopods in the movie are mutated to be super large and hyper-aggressive, and the hosts get some other symptoms that don't occur in the fish, like boils and lesions and intense pain. Because they're large and hyper-aggressive, this causes them to range far outside their normal ecological niche, and they end up killing almost 40% of life within the bay, eventually outright attacking humans. The movie kind of jumps between characters during the outbreak, which is extremely potent and seemingly uncontainable, and ends with the government killing all the isopods with chlorine, and covering up the incident entirely. The movie itself is intended to be an expose on what actually happened. I mentioned that the mutated isopods no longer fill their evolutionary niche. For parasites, one essential aspect of the niche is a concept called virulence. Virulence is basically how much a parasite harms its host. Is it mostly imperceptible? Is it harmful but not fatal? Is it eventually fatal? It might seem like parasites should extract as much nutrition as possible from the host, be as virulent as possible, but the problem is that this might kill the host, and most parasites can't live outside a host. And a premature death might mean that the isopods can't spread as effectively. Plus, being more virulent can result in stronger immune responses from the host. Basically, in the arms race between parasite and host, the parasite will tend to evolve to a kind of optimal virulence level, extracting resources and nutrients from the host, while trying to simultaneously keep it alive and well enough for future generations to be produced. While the theory of virulence is difficult to test and has received mixed results empirically, the isopods in this movie clearly illustrate what happens when a parasite can become too virulent. While the isopods are able to quickly reproduce and spread, even successfully jumping to a new host species, that being humanity, they also trigger a kind of social immune response due to how much of a threat they pose. Humans don't just have bodily immune systems. We also think and plan and organize, and the gravity of the threat provoked an organized response from humanity to immediately eradicate the entire parasitic species, and the isopods didn't have an evolutionarily achieved countermeasure for this. Species in the genus Plasmodium, for example, can afford to be deadly because they are also really hard to fully erase, and even if the current animal hosts are disastrously sick, they'll still be transmitted by mosquitoes. Not so for these isopods. Optimal virulence is something that takes a long evolutionary battle to develop, and the overnight jump these creatures made to humanity meant that their virulence was far too strong. How does the Bay relate to the aforementioned thematic concepts? The Bay largely uses the parasites as a plot device, similar to a kind of bacterial or viral outbreak. But the chicken farmers and their corrupt practices can be seen as a kind of metaphorical parasite, harming the very society and environment that they end up selling the chicken to. The government in the movie is established to have known about the toxic dumping and outbreak, and either covered it up or just failed to respond properly. The government can be seen as a kind of societal immune system, which should have prevented the corrupt farming practices from harming anybody, but they failed, leading to disastrous consequences. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the movie ends with the survivors of the catastrophe being paid to keep quiet about the situation. They are silenced. The government does the same thing that the isopods do, taking the people's tongue and their voice away. And the movie ends with the people regaining the thing that the parasites and the government took from them by making the movie. Ticks. Also featuring a real but heavily mutated parasite, and at the complete opposite of the political spectrum from the Bay's skeptical, environmentalist, and anti-corporate nature, is the 1993 movie Ticks, directed by Tony Randell. This is not a great movie and has some very questionable character portrayals, but features some genuinely excellent and disgusting practical effects. The premise is that marijuana farmers living deep in the woods have been injecting steroids and whatnot into their plants to make them grow faster and bigger, yielding more cash. Unfortunately, the wood tick, also known as Dermacentor variabilis, or the American dog tick, lives there too, and some of the steroid-infused runoff mutates the ticks, making them bigger, faster, and just overall more powerful. We follow a group of troubled teens on a wilderness retreat as they eventually face off against the tick infestation and the people responsible for it. It ends with the teens burning the ticks to death, including an even larger super tick. It's goofy, but again, the practical effects are great. As with The Bay, Ticks takes a real parasite and imagines a mutated, more virulent form of it. For most of the developed world, ticks are one of the only parasites that most people will actually ever confront. And as someone who enjoys hiking, this movie captures the way we romanticize the wilderness as a place of healing and relaxation, when really, the wild is not a comforting, hospitable place, and ticks are one of the main ways most people who love the outdoors end up confronting this fact. Nothing ruins a hike or camping trip faster than the thought of a tick. The American dog tick opportunistically latches onto passing animals and crawls around on them looking for a suitable patch of skin. When it's satisfied, Dermacentor variabilis grabs onto a fold of skin, saws it open, and inserts a barbed, bony harpoon called the hypostome into the wound, which anchors the tick firmly. It even secretes a cement-like substance around itself, further attaching to the host. When blood wells up into the wound in an attempt to seal the opening, the tick sucks it up, even injecting anticoagulants to keep the blood flowing freely. The movie's main change to the ticks makes them less passive and opportunistic, and more active and predatory. They barely even function as parasites in the movie, instead becoming more like a commonplace carnivorous predator. They hunt and stalk and consume, barely allowing the host to live for any period of time. Ticks is, in my read, an anti-drug reefer madness type of story, and uses its parasitic antagonist to facilitate its message. This was made in the 90s, in the midst of the war on drugs, and when concerns about teen so-called super predators abounded. So of course it follows at-risk teens. The movie continually and exhaustingly reminds us that one of the major risks that the teens face is marijuana. Thus, the greedy backwoods weed farmers are framed as parasitic forces, siphoning the potential away from already struggling kids. It makes sense then that their parasitism manifests directly in the form of the ticks. These blood-sucking monsters are direct results of the farmers' parasitic greed. They only exist to feed on the teens because of the careless way that the drug suppliers attempted to maximize profits. In this way, they are at once indirect proxies of, and thematic parallels for, the parasitism of the weed growers. And the movie makes one key change to the American dog tick species that supports this interpretation. Dermacentor variabilis is known to eventually release a paralytic neurotoxin into its saliva, which is fully reversible if the tick is removed, but can actually slowly lead to death if untreated. In the movie, this subtle adaptation of the ticks is changed to be a radically strong hallucinogenic, which very pointedly is likened to LSD. So yeah, if the thematic message wasn't clear enough, Ticks eschews all subtlety and straightforwardly turns its monster into what is little more than a fatal hallucinogenic drug. Ticks ultimately uses its parasitic story to play into the war on drugs, and all of the associated moral panics of the time. It doesn't question the status quo, it merely reproduces and preserves it. I'm sure you're seeing now that parasitism is a potent political tool. We've had a movie that uses parasitism to convey an environmentalist message, as well as one that tells a pro-war on drugs story. Every political ideology, in fact, uses the concept of parasitism against its political opponents. And a characteristic of the most extreme, dangerous, and uncompromising ideologies is when they assign the charge of parasitism to something immaterial and essential and inescapable about the group itself. Brain Damage. Brain Damage, directed by Frank Henenlotter and released in 1988, is a movie that, like Ticks, tries to explore drug use, but actually does it rather well. This movie is awesome. Though low budget, I found its effects to be gross, performances to be great, and story to be gripping. Ticks feels like it was made by someone who's only heard propaganda about marijuana. Brain Damage feels like it was made by someone who has actually done drugs and maybe struggled with addiction. Brain Damage follows Brian as he encounters Aylmer, a small, leech-looking creature. Aylmer lives on Brian's body, and periodically injects his brain with a blue fluid that makes Brian experience a euphoria unlike any other, with enchanting, colorful hallucinations. However, during Brian's trips, Aylmer will feed on random people's brains. The movie follows Brian as he struggles morally with Elmer's actions, tries to quit the drug, isolates himself from friends and family, and it ends with Brian overdosing and attempting to commit suicide. While parasites are not known to drug their hosts in the way that Aylmer does, some parasites, which we will discuss later, like Toxoplasma gondii, do mess directly with neurotransmitters and do affect desires of the host. The connection I'd like to make here is something slightly more indirect. Brian, at one point in the movie, tries to resist Elmer's drug and goes through harsh withdrawal. You might think this isn't something possible in the parasite world, and you'd be right overall because parasites obviously aren't addictive drugs, but there is evidence in parasitology suggesting that absence of parasites can have negative effects and reveal a sort of dependency. There is an idea known as the old friends hypothesis, which basically states that through coevolution with parasites and other microorganisms, we actually depend on them for immunoregulation. Our immune systems have evolved to be very strong and to attack viciously things like intestinal worms, for example. And many of these worms, like T. suis, the whipworm, can dampen that immune response for itself while still allowing it to function for other organisms, like infectious bacteria. But now, in the developed world, people really don't have intestinal worms because of modern medicine. And at the same time as the eradication of parasites, immune-related diseases like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease have appeared, where it seems like the body is attacking the gut too much. And a few studies have found that therapeutic benefits can be found by reintroducing gut parasites. This is called helminthic therapy after the worms. T. suis may help treat Crohn's, for example, by dampening an overactive immune system. Other diseases and parasites are being investigated, but it should be said that this is far from an accepted scientific fact, as of yet. Evidence isn't fully conclusive and needs much more research. Regardless, this is an interesting avenue in parasitology, suggesting that the absence of intestinal parasites because of long coevolution actually reveals a kind of physiological dependence. So sure, it isn't drug withdrawal in any sense, but it is a dependence. The human body may have become truly accustomed to the presence of a parasite. Brain damage makes the drug the parasite, but it does it in a far more interesting way than ticks. Ticks posits drugs as outside predatory forces that will just randomly take your vitality away without your control or input. Brain damage highlights the personal pull towards the drug. It shows that drug addiction is a personal medical struggle and is able to capture many of the phenomena that addicts end up facing. Euphoric drugs, like Aylmer in the movie, are kind of like parasites that we choose, despite the fact that they may be harming us. Brain damage is scary then because Brian wants the parasite. He chooses it again and again, and his attempts to stop choosing it fail completely. The Thaw. 2009's The Thaw, directed by Mark A. Lewis, is a movie that sees all of humanity as the real parasite. Its environmentalist ideology is totalizing and pessimistic about humanity's role in the Earth's future. This movie is not very good, and is pretty light on actual parasitism, but has an interesting message. The basic premise is that, like in real life, ice around the world is melting due to global warming. A research team up north discovers that the waning ice has revealed a preserved woolly mammoth. Unfortunately, the mammoth was infected with a very deadly insect-like parasite. It basically lays eggs in hosts and slowly eats them from the inside out. The original team all die or appear to die very quickly. Another group, this time of students, arrives at the research site and goes through the exact same thing. One of the members of the original group returns alive, but he has infected himself with the parasite, intending to bring it back to civilization, starting an epidemic that will teach people the true danger of climate change. He is stopped, but the movie ends on a scene that implies the parasite will soon spread to civilization anyways. The dangers of climate change are unavoidable. The parasites here aren't expanded upon much and aren't very interesting. While they aren't flies, their tendency to deposit their young in and on the flesh of hosts reminds one of parasites that induced myiasis, which refers to infection by fly maggots. Lucilia silvarum is a blowfly that can lay eggs on the back of a frog, where they then hatch and feast on said frog. Same with the so-called New World screwworm, which can lay eggs in already open wounds or healthy but soft parts, like eyes. So the parasitic behavior in the movie is closely related to real-world behavior. The threat of unearthing something dangerous as a result of climate change is something the movie is deeply concerned with, and this has actually happened before. In Siberia in 2016, for example, thawing permafrost allowed a population of Bacillus anthracis, which causes the disease anthrax, to reactivate. The ensuing epidemic was ultimately contained, reportedly with only one human death, that of a little boy. There is also a report of an apparently non-parasitic nematode, P. columbiensis, being revived after being in cryptobiosis, basically stasis, for as long as 46,000 years. So ancient parasites coming back isn't something too far-fetched. As you can see here though, this movie's fear about returning parasites isn't really a unique one. Ancient bacteria and ancient viruses are just as, if not more likely. And the Thaw's parasitic creature is mostly just a plot device to foster discussion surrounding climate change, where the obvious parasitic comparison is humanity. We are the parasite, the virus, we are the problem, and Earth's immune response, heating up, is bound to kill us. And so the movie frequently flirts with ideas of ecoterrorism and bioterrorism, even climate nihilism and normative extinction. The worse that the environment gets, the more extreme measures might have to be taken. The stuff. The Thaw was kind of bleak. Let's move on to something more fun. One of my favorite examples from the movies I watched was the 1985 sci-fi horror movie called The Stuff, directed by Larry Cohen. While an overall imperfect movie with an endlessly convenient plot, The Stuff is a wildly entertaining and baffling ride, with some fun, if on-the-nose commentary about consumerism and greed and political spectacle and fad diets. The setup is that a strange, white, yogurt-like substance known as the stuff is discovered bubbling up from the ground. It tastes addictively good, and is soon a fully packaged and mass-advertised product that has started a runaway diet and food craze. Soon, the ailing ice cream industry hires an industrial saboteur to find out the secrets of the stuff. He finds that the stuff only passed FDA testing because the administration was paid off, and later, he finds that the stuff is a parasitic organism leaking from a subterranean source, which takes control of the people who eat too much of it. And later, the stuff eats them in return, using the host's nutrients to multiply. The people controlled seem to retain some elements of their personality, but find themselves compelled to spread the stuff, and will try to kill anybody who might expose the scheme. So, the stuff's main method of transmission is mostly to make itself as ingestible as possible, by tasting good, posing as a health food, weaponizing advertising, and exerting the peer pressure of those it already controls. The stuff is eventually defeated when, after discovering the true parasitic nature of the food, the saboteur links up with a far-right paramilitary group, and together they destroy the manufacturing plant and broadcast a warning message, causing people to stop consuming it. It's revealed afterwards that the stuff and the ice cream industry have resolved their differences and are planning to introduce a new product, called The Taste, which contains a lower amount of the stuff, but presumably still a lethal amount. Luckily, the saboteur stops them before this can lead anywhere. The stuff is a bit of a unique parasite. Is it an animal, a plant, a fungus? Who knows? It's just the stuff. We don't really get much in the way of genuine detail about it, other than observing that it tries to propagate itself by increasing its likelihood of being ingested in various ways. And luckily for us, this is something that is observed in the world of parasitology. One can remember the way that the lancet fluke hijacks the ants and makes it basically offer itself up to grazing animals, but this almost seems too simple and blunt compared to what the stuff does. An ant's brain is simple machinery, after all, and that type of control is not subtle. For something a bit more exciting and insidious, we can turn to a distant cousin of the Plasmodium genus, called Toxoplasma gondii. This is a microscopic parasite that lives in the very cells of the host organism. Toxoplasma actually infects anywhere from 30 to 50% of the world's human population. And a growing area of research shows that, once thought to be mostly harmless to adults, an infection of Toxoplasma in humans actually might cause startling, subtle shifts in cognitive ability and personality. This is beyond the scope of this video though, and I would love to do a follow-up on the science and philosophy of Toxoplasma. Toxoplasma generally doesn't want to be in a human. Its definitive host, and the only place where sexual reproduction can occur, is a cat. Cats will excrete feces containing egg-like Toxoplasma cysts, which will then be ingested by various animals. The best one for Toxoplasma, though, is a rat or other small prey animal. If, say, a rat eats the cysts, they will infect its cells and engage in mass asexual reproduction, and then another kind of mass cystification. Within the rat, these new things called zoedocysts can persist for months or years, waiting to be consumed by a cat. And if a cat does happen to kill and eat the rat, the cycle is completed. Of course, rats and the like don't particularly want to get eaten. Cats are good hunters, but rats are great at evading felines. They are good at distinguishing familiar places from unfamiliar places, having well-documented spatial memories. And further, they have a visceral, negative response to cat urine. But researchers have found that toxoplasma, specifically Toxoplasma zoedocysts in the rat's brain, will turn the rat's defense mechanisms against them. Infected rats are more likely to range into unfamiliar, likely less safe spaces, increasing the chances that they encounter a hungry cat. And further, they actually display a preference to be around and within cat urine. Toxoplasma drives rats into the most dangerous areas possible, making it extremely likely that they will then be consumed. And please trust me, dear viewer, this kind of subtle manipulation is very common among parasites in general. Another example is the flatworm Leucochloridium, which wants to end up in a bird. To do this, it will infect snails, take over their eye stalks, and cause them to kind of expand and hypnotically pulsate. The effect of this is to make their eye stalks look like a crawling, yummy little caterpillar or other bug larva, and the effect is startlingly accurate, and for my part, kind of mesmerizing. For a bird, this is basically the parasite making the snail beg to get eaten. But this is just a physiological change. The infected snail also becomes much more mobile, more likely to stay on high leaves, and much less nocturnal. And these behavioral changes greatly increase the likelihood of getting consumed by a bird. Just as the stuff weaponizes our need to be healthy, and our need to fit in, and our very taste preferences in order to ingest it, and thus in turn get eaten by it, so do parasites like Toxoplasma and Leucochloridium influence their intermediate hosts to endanger themselves, even directly inverting their survival instincts in order to get eaten and thus continue the life cycle. And this is exactly the critique of consumerism that the movie presents. The stuff shows us that advertising and fads and other consumerist structures create needs and drives in us that aren't aligned with our well-being. Maybe they convince you to eat unhealthy junk food, consume poisonous substances like alcohol, and spend valuable money not on things that you need, but things that companies need you to need. In the stuff, consumer capitalism is the parasite, and this addictive alien cream is its ultimate embodiment. There's also something of a puzzling political message. I mentioned that the saboteur, himself an extremely greedy man, teams up with what is basically a fascist, racist paramilitary group in order to combat the stuff. And the group is truly instrumental in its ultimate defeat. There seems to be something of a hint that really, capital itself is the enemy that should cross political divides. Consumerism and corporate greed parasitize us all the same, no matter if on the right or the left. The movie ends with the two rival competitive companies teaming up, despite being sworn enemies at first. The stuff is telling us that competition, an inbuilt mechanism in the capitalist economic system, doesn't mean that better companies will replace worse companies. If that were true, the human, non-parasitic ice cream company would have just fully replaced the stuff entirely. No, the stuff's message is that corporate greed in all its forms is parasitic, and competition can sometimes just be a form of controlled opposition, or worse, a precursor to a merged company with even greater market dominance. The stuff is scary to me for two reasons. For one, it weaponizes the fear of not fitting in, of facing overwhelming peer pressure. And two, because it makes the ingestion of the parasite something you want, kind of like brain damage. It's like junk food. It may be killing you, but it sure is fun to eat. The stuff takes these two everyday pressures and makes them genuinely terrifying to great effect. Slither. I mentioned in the section on Alien that its parasites are used to cause a fear of penetration, and to invert sex and reproduction into something truly terrifying. Another movie that does this is the 2006 James Gunn movie, Slither. This movie is fun, nasty, and highly entertaining, and is reminiscent of the classic movie Night of the Creeps, which I'll talk more about later. Slither takes place in a small town called Wheelsey, where an alien parasite happens to land. Wheelsey is home to Grant, a wealthy older man, and his younger, beautiful wife, Starla. Grant tries to initiate sex with Starla, and after many rebukes in response to Grant's overwhelming pressure, Grant leaves, hurt and enraged. He meets up with another woman, Brenda, at a bar, and they go for a walk in the woods, crossing a few boundaries along the way. There, Grant is infected by the alien slug-like parasite. He undergoes a startling metamorphosis throughout the movie. In the end, he's basically just a giant blob that assimilates everything, but at first, he's mostly a tentacled human being with an intense need to procreate. He forcibly impregnates Brenda, and once pregnant, she eats voraciously, becoming basically a giant sack filled with more alien slugs. She literally explodes, the slugs infect everyone, and Starla and a few of the other townsfolk have to fight off the parasitic invasion. When these newborn slugs infect someone, their personalities are assimilated into a hive mind, controlled by the original slug, and physically they act kind of like zombies. And otherwise, the parasite here basically perverts the reproductive drive that's already within humanity into serving its own purposes. And as has been the story here, this is definitely found in the world of parasites. We can find this particularly in a parasitic barnacle called Sacculina carcini, one of the most fascinating parasitic specimens. Before maturing, Sacculina, like any other barnacle, roams around as a free-living larva called a cypress. However, unlike other barnacles, the female attaches to a crab. It finds a vulnerable spot in the crab's armor, and basically injects a mass of cells into its body. But this mass of cells is actually the female Sacculina, leaving behind its crustacean body outside. This is basically a kind of molting. The injected little mass of cells, like a slug, moves around in the crab, finding a nerve cluster, and begins to feed on the crab and grow, eventually with an external reproductive portion hanging between the crab's legs, in the exact spot where a crab's brood pouch would normally hang, and also has tendrils that spread entirely throughout the crab, putting it utterly under Sacculina's control. From there, one or more male Sacculina will come and fertilize the female. But what's interesting is how this process affects the host crab. For one, the crab can no longer molt, and thus no longer grow. Further, it castrates the host. Both growth and reproduction on the crab's part would take energy away from Sacculina, so the parasites put a stop to these mechanisms. But the parasite also makes the crab care for its own brood as if it were the crab's own. If the female Sacculina infected a male crab, the male crab is actually feminized to better mother its new surrogate young. Its abdomen becomes broader, able to accommodate a female brood pouch, or now a Sacculina externa. In general, the crabs display the same kind of reproductive and maternal behavior that they would for their own young, but now it's redirected to care for the parasite infecting it. The crab will protect the Sacculina externa hanging between its legs, as if it were its own brood pouch there, and it actually helps to disperse the larvae when they are ready to be born. So just like the parasite in Slither, Sacculina induces serious physiological changes, particularly related to sex characteristics in its host, and similarly uses the host's innate reproductive drive for its own purposes. The Slither parasite makes Brenda balloon with its young, just as Sacculina expands and expands, even hanging out of the host crab. And while the Slither parasite doesn't feminize Grant as Sacculina would for a male crab, it definitely does change his physiology to support its own purposes. Truly, the world of parasitism is a strange place. Just as Sacculina and the Slither slug take and manipulate reproductive equipment and the nurturing drive for their own purposes, so too does Grant in Slither, the husband of Starla. Starla and Grant have a drastic gap in age, and Grant seems to have used his wealth, in short his power, as a way to attract the young vulnerable Starla. And Grant seems entitled to Starla's body, displaying protest behavior when she won't have sex with him. And given how Starla speaks in the movie, he doesn't sound like he prioritizes mutual sexual pleasure. And while Grant will talk about the sacred value of marriage and how Starla needs to be a good wife, Grant displays very little hesitation to cheat. Grant seems to embody a kind of parasitic entitlement to women's bodies, and shows how institutions like marriage can be used to wield double-sided influence over them. Grant will barely tolerate other male attention to Starla, and he feels like, as her husband, that he owns her body, but she doesn't get the equivalent ownership over him. And of course, the age gap of their relationship further enhances the parasitism that's on display. Like in Alien, Grant's tentacles and the few scenes of alien-infused sexual intercourse we see are definitely effective at generating a disgust at penetration. It's really nasty and slimy and uncomfortable, and Brenda's ballooning shows another horrifying reproductive state, like the chestburster. Slither is another example of inverting sexuality and using parasites to convey this fear and disgust, and does it in a similarly feminist light by criticizing the male entitlement to women's bodies. Shivers. Shivers is a 1975 horror movie directed by David Cronenberg. It's a fun movie, but definitely fails to escape that period's obsession with toplessness and struggles to find thematic footing. The premise is pretty simple. A scientist has engineered a parasite that, when in a human being, basically either distorts their sexual preferences or exaggerates existing ones. causing the host to become a sexually violent and perverted maniac. And the parasite will spread through the subsequent reproductive acts, which are almost always non-consensual. The movie takes place in a luxury apartment complex and follows a doctor as he becomes aware of and tries to stop the spreading infection. He fails, though, and the movie ends with the parasite spreading to the wider city. As strange as the idea of a sexually perverting parasite is, the book Parasite Rex actually makes a really interesting connection here. There's a parasitic fungus that infects flies, causing them to, like the lancet liver fluke and the infected ant, go somewhere high, where the flies will die and the fungus will release spores into the wind. However, there is another way that the fungus will spread. The corpse of an infected female fly will secrete chemical compounds that draw uninfected male flies and cause them to mate with the corpse, which of course causes them to become infected. So not only does this parasitic fungus control the behavior of the infected host, but it also controls the behavior of uninfected male flies too, and causes a sexual, maniacal, necrophilic perversion in them. Admittedly, Shivers falls a bit flat on the thematic angle for me. I believe it's trying to channel that same fear of violation and sexual violence that Alien and Slither do, but I don't think it handled it very well. Unfortunately, Shivers eventually devolves into a kind of zombie movie, which doesn't really utilize the parasitic premise as much as it could. I'd be very interested, though, to hear your thoughts on the meaning of Shivers in the comments below. Night of the Creeps. Speaking of zombie movies, there are a slew of quote-unquote parasite horror movies that do little more than replicate the zombie genre with just a slight change in cause. Rather than rabies or some other virus or bacteria, this time it's a parasite, or what the movie thinks is a parasite. The most famous of these is probably Fred Dekar's 1986 horror comedy Night of the Creeps. Like Slither, there is an alien slug that lands on Earth and infects people. But unlike Slither's interesting reproductive mutations, the parasite here seems to instantly kill its victims and just drives around their bodies. Despite what the movie claims, this is barely a parasite and more resembles a straightforward predator. Night of the Creeps seems to think that a parasite is something in itself, rather than defined as one part of a relation between living host and parasite. So it sees a slug that crawls in your mouth and controls your body as a parasite, despite the fact that it immediately kills you and just puppets your corpse. There's no meaningful host-parasite relationship because there's nothing living to be parasitized. The slug doesn't parasitize anything living. To be clear, I really like this movie and I think it's worth a watch, but I don't think it really is a parasite movie. And even its commentary on masculinity and dumb frat bros is made with the zombie trope rather than the parasite trope. So despite the fact that Night of the Creeps is technically a classic of the parasite horror genre, I think this is mostly in name only. It uses quote-unquote parasitism in a very shallow way, and would probably contribute more to a discussion on the zombie genre. The Faculty. 1998's The Faculty, directed by Robert Rodriguez, unlike Night of the Creeps, actually does have a meaningful parasite-host relationship, so there is room for discussion here, but kind of like Night of the Creeps and the zombie genre, The Faculty feels more like a body snatcher movie than a parasite movie. The Faculty understands itself as being in direct dialogue with Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and also Robert Heinlein's book, The Puppet Masters, which was adapted into a rough movie, which I will not be discussing here. So I'll analyze The Faculty and its parasitic aspects, but there is a sense in which it might also benefit from being discussed in a different category of horror movie. The Faculty follows a variety of outsiders in high school as the faculty, and then the student body, become infiltrated by an alien parasite that controls the mind. These outsiders come together after increasingly mysterious happenings and decide to fight back. Zeke, one of the outsiders, is a drug dealer who produces a synthetic drug that is able to kill the parasite, and they embark on a quest to kill the alien queen, under the logic that the parasite adheres to science fiction laws. Eventually, they discover that the queen was one of them the entire time, and they kill her, saving the day. While there are a few wrinkles here and there, overwhelmingly the story of the Faculty is quite simple. The parasite in the movie is not expanded upon much, and its biology isn't of much importance. What matters more, again since it is more of a body snatcher movie, is that it's able to infiltrate and invade, going undetected. It is able to talk and act and look exactly like what it wants to infect, seeming completely invisible. This kind of stealth is a parasite staple, And we can find real examples of infiltration and camouflage in the domain of parasitism. One example is the blood fluke, a genus of trematodes like the lancet liver fluke from before. These flukes do try to infect humans. They live in water, and when sensing human skin, they immediately drill inside. Once in the bloodstream, these flukes evade detection from the immune system by basically hiding themselves in a ghillie suit made of molecules from our own blood. It's actually much more complicated and dynamic than that, and the science is still emerging, but the blood fluke seems to hijack host antigens, making the host's immune system not see something foreign, but instead see itself. It makes itself look as if it belongs. In fact, genome analysis has found that nucleotide sequences are remarkably similar between humans and the blood fluke, and it's speculated, though not fully demonstrated, that this might be another case of horizontal gene transfer. And in The Faculty, among these other body snatcher movies, the parasites will end up specifically trying to compromise the protective power structures. In The Faculty, they are the school's officials, and eventually the police and parents. These can be likened to the immune system of society, as I discussed in The Bay, and invading and subverting these systems is key to the overall infection. Parasites in real life do this kind of thing. Leishmania, for example, is a parasitic protozoan, and it stimulates the immune system to react in a way that it is practically guaranteed to survive. Leishmania hides inside macrophages, the immune system's agents that basically go out and eat foreign particles and entities. So this parasite literally lives inside the body's cells that are designed to kill things. Now, the normal response to this would be to send inflammatory T cells, another immune system soldier, which goes and aids the macrophage in killing what it's swallowed. But Leishmania subverts our immune system from within, and tricks the immune system into sending T cells that aid in antibody production instead. Antibodies only work on things outside of macrophages, and so Leishmania, hidden inside the macrophage, ends up being safe. It invades our support systems from within, and guarantees that the ways in which those systems respond benefit its life cycle. Historically, this body snatcher genre has really been about stuff like the Red Scare. It's a metaphor for evil communists invading our society and whatnot. But The Faculty does something a bit different. The main group of rebellious kids are mostly outsiders, people who don't fit the mold. Zeke is a drug-dealing intellectual who runs circles around his teachers. Stokely is a goth sci-fi nerd. Mary Beth is a new girl. Stan is a disaffected football star who wants to leave the team. And Casey is a bullied photographer. All of them, in various ways, don't mesh with the established social order and clash with it in many ways. And the parasite in The Faculty is a way to make that established social order seem more aggressive and parasitic. It's a force that saps your individuality and enforces sameness. It's a hive mind that tries to assimilate everything it can. And the outsiders are only able to resist by leaning into the very things that make them different. Zeke develops a drug that kills the parasite, and Casey is able to frequently escape the parasite because he's so fast, a trait he's developed by running from bullies. So The Faculty uses parasitism more on a cultural, personal level, as a metaphor for individuality and being your own person. And the parasitism is the way that the status quo social order presents itself as if it's the right way to do things, but in many ways, it takes away the very things that make you who you are. I think The Faculty and the real parasites that embody the infiltration and evasion within the movie are scary to me because they weaponize the things that should genuinely be to our benefit. We place a lot of trust in teachers, parents, nurses, coaches, and police officers, hoping that they will have our best interests at heart. And often, those groups are charged with protecting and raising the most innocent and precious members of society, namely children, who really have no way of protecting themselves. So it's scary to see a world in which these people are turned evil and parasitic, and it's scary to know that parasites may be doing the very same thing within our bodies, using our own likenesses against us, and turning our trusted immune systems into their tools. Other movies. There are a few other movies that I would consider horror adjacent, and are worth remarking on, but don't fully fit the horror mold. I'll cover 3 here. Parasite. The first is Parasite, the Oscar-winning classic from South Korean master filmmaker Bong Joon-ho. A full dissection of this multi-layered movie is far, far beyond the scope of this video. In fact, it could truly be a video all on its own. Here, I mostly want to comment on the most obvious mode of parasitism within the movie. The main plot follows the Kim family as they try to infiltrate the wealthy Park family. They are able to get jobs as the English tutor, art therapist, driver, and housekeeper, by using their intellect against the Park family's trusting nature, convincing the Parks that the Kims are just like them, have their best interests at heart, and are worthy of being welcomed into the family's home. So it's partially similar to The Faculty and other body snatcher movies in that regard, because it's about infiltration, but this is more on a social level rather than the body snatcher kind of infiltration. Social parasitism is actually a common thing in the animal kingdom, and we can look at a classic case of this. There is an ectoparasitic ant known as Tetramorium inquilinum. This ant species actually lacks a worker caste, and female queens and males persist almost entirely by latching onto the backs of other species of related ants, mostly on the queens of those colonies. Now, normally, those intruders would be killed, but Tetramorium inquilinum is insidious, and sends chemical signals to the host colony that make them appear as other queens of that host species. Because they think they're queens, the workers of the parasitized colony will bring them food to eat. Tetramorium inquilinum, like the family in Parasite, uses appropriate signals, social signals in the movie, but chemical signals for the ants, that make them appear as though they should be trusted and cared for. Parasite, while not a horror movie, is scary on a kind of conceptual level. It shows that trust is really just a leap of faith, often based on pure blind belief, and an overemphasis on observable behavior. People can take complete advantage of you without you ever even knowing. The Hidden. The Hidden is a 1987 action horror sci-fi movie from director Jack Sholder. The plot is very basic. There's an alien parasite that uses human hosts to fulfill its appetite for violence and money and, literally anything. It's a materialistic freak and it just goes after anything that catches its eye. This results in a string of crimes that seems to have caught the FBI's attention, and the movie follows the attempts to finally put a stop to the parasite. The alien parasite here is a host switcher that mostly changes when its host body is unable to be utilized further, generally resulting from the crimes it commits. I won't say that this kind of behavior is non-existent in the parasite kingdom, but direct analogs aren't exactly common. Probably the most similar things are creatures like leeches and mites, who kind of feed and detach when fulfilled. In general though, parasites tend to use specific hosts to fulfill certain developmental, reproductive goals, and switching hosts often isn't even possible. And if it is possible, it's not something common, because parasites that are capable of switching to new hosts for non-developmental purposes generally aren't too virulent, so they wouldn't need to switch to a new host because the old one is worn out. The Hidden's materialistic, selfish parasite is basically a commentary on the parasitism and harm of egoism and selfishness. The Hidden's alien creature is completely without regard for other beings, and it just goes along and fulfills whatever random whim it has. And a lot of the dialogue of the movie focuses on the harm and impingement that this has on the surrounding people. It's a simple reminder to, basically, not be selfish and materialistic. The Hidden is a simple, lean movie that has a simple, lean parasitic metaphor. Deranged. Deranged, a 2012 Korean thriller from director Park Jung-woo, is probably the least horror-like movie on this list, containing barely even a few creepy elements. It, for the most part, is a kind of medical outbreak movie, but has such a cool parasite that I kind of had to include it. Much like The Bay and Ticks, Deranged talks about an actual parasite. Nematomorpha is a phylum of worms, known as hairworms, that infect arthropods, mostly crickets and beetles and grasshoppers. Now, this is still emerging science, so I'll be conservative here, but in at least some hairworm species, the worm will manipulate the host to jump into water and drown itself, where the worms then emerge and mate. Most species within Nematomorpha need the host to go into water in some way just to reproduce, but only a few have been documented to genuinely drive the host to drown itself. And it's speculated that the hairworms basically make their host go crazy with thirst, which causes them to immerse themselves in water, where they will likely die, and the hairworm will emerge. The exact neural mechanism is not understood, but the behavior is definitely there. The hairworms will affect the hosts in some way, which causes them to seek water against their best interests, generally drowning themselves, which is necessary for the reproductive process of the hairworm. Deranged just takes this and applies it to humans through a scientifically augmented species of hairworm. It talks all about the actual parasite in the movie, and follows a pretty standard medical outbreak formula from that premise. In the movie, the outbreak is planned by a corporation that had already developed the cure in advance. They induce the hairworm epidemic, and then control the supply of the medicine to make absurd amounts of money from it. So there's another example of the parasitism of greedy companies and the motivations of capitalism. Deranged isn't very scary overall, but I think the idea that normal healthy drives can be subverted for a parasitic purpose is truly frightening. You think you're just particularly thirsty, because we all need water, and then suddenly you're drowning. That, and plus it's just disgusting to see a bunch of squirming little hairworms. Parasites in the real world. Now that we've gotten through the analysis and scientific discussion of the movies and their associated parasites, I want to do two things. I'll give a brief recommendation tier list in a second, but first I want to return to something I briefly mentioned in the beginning. While completely fascinating biological entities, parasites are overwhelmingly destructive for human beings. Malaria, caused by the Plasmodium genus, is one of the biggest killers of humans in the world, with around 282 million cases in 2024 and an estimated 610,000 deaths, an overwhelming majority of which are concentrated in the developing world. And that is truly just the tip of the iceberg. Guinea worm, blood flukes causing schistomiasis, trypanosomes causing Chagas disease and sleeping sickness, elephantiasis caused by parasites like filarial worms, and so many more. Parasites are, for many people, not something fun you can learn about in an awesome YouTube video, but an invisible threat that's associated with pain, disfigurement, disease, and death. I wanted to list a few organizations here that are working to combat parasitic diseases in some way, and if you have a couple dollars and a tiny bit of time, they truly are worth giving to. Donate $5, then send the charity to your friends to humble brag, maybe even getting them to donate. Every organization I'll list is highly rated or at least very widely respected, and there are many more that I can't list, so please do some research if you're interested. Obviously, given the video's topic, these will be organizations that combat parasitic diseases either specifically or in part. I'm not claiming that these should be prioritized over other charities, or that they are the most important or best. This is mostly for awareness due to the relevant topic. Donate to whatever you want. At the end of the day, it's better than not doing it at all. These are just some particularly salient options. Malaria Consortium is a highly respected charity that targets malaria and other preventable tropical diseases, largely trying to prevent these illnesses in children through medicine and insecticidal net distribution, as well as education. The Against Malaria Foundation is another highly rated charity that mostly focuses on distributing insecticidal nets. Since malaria is one of the most dangerous threats to humanity, these two organizations in particular are often highlighted as some of the most cost-effective, impactful places to send money. Doctors Without Borders is another popular charity that provides more direct, boots-on-the-ground medical care for many diseases, including a few parasitic ones. Unlimit Health is an organization dedicated to deworming. This combats schistomiasis, caused by the aforementioned blood flukes and other worms, and soil-transmitted helminthiasis, caused by intestinal worms. The End Fund is another organization that tries to combat neglected tropical diseases like schistomiasis, river blindness, and leishmaniasis. A similar organization is the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, targeting leishmaniasis, Chagas disease, sleeping sickness, and many more. These are truly just a few. There are so many more. Just a few dollars can go a long way. In many cases, life-changing medication is genuinely just a few dollars, sometimes even less. So the impact is definitely there if you want to make it. Recommendations. Alright, now that we've talked about a few places out of many that are probably worth your money and energy, let's end the video talking about which movies are actually worth watching. I'll just put them into tiers depending on quality and whether or not they're worth your time. There will be the essential tier, the highly recommended tier, the recommended tier, and the lowly recommended tier. And these are being recommended as general movies, not whether they're good parasite horror movies. It should be clear above which movies actually use the concept of parasitism well and which don't. In the essential tier we have Parasite. This one is obvious, it's universally acclaimed, and extremely deep and subtle. Not really horror, but tense and affecting, and has cool parasitic parallels. Alien. Another obvious one. This is one of the best horror movies of all time, and has the coolest fictional parasite that has ever been invented. It's terrifying and thematic and near perfect. Brain Damage. Maybe I'm insane, but this was actually my favorite movie of the ones I hadn't seen before. It's weird and old and a little goofy, but I kind of loved every second of it. It's got awesome music, a cool parasite, compelling drama, interesting themes, and a crazy ending. This was such a pleasant surprise. The Stuff. This was probably my second favorite of the ones I hadn't seen before. It was fun, thematic, and wild. with some over-the-top and thoroughly enjoyable performances. It's also kind of cozy, and I really enjoyed that. Slither. This movie made me extremely happy that I just chose this video to make. It's got great effects, an awesome monster, funny but not overbearing humor, and what I found to be good themes. And in the highly recommended tier we have The Bay. This is a very solid found footage movie with great themes and an awesome real-world parasite. I think the only thing it lacks is a solid emotional core, making it a bit of an unfocused experience, but otherwise it is really sick and creepy and disturbing and frustrating. Night of the Creeps. This is like the quintessential B-movie. It's silly, eminently quotable, and a little bit stupid, yet thoroughly entertaining. Not my favorite, but I'm happy I saw this. And in the recommended tier, we have Shivers. I didn't love this one, and it's mostly because I struggle to name things I like about it. I didn't hate anything about it, other than its sleazy preference for toplessness, so it's not something I wouldn't recommend, but if someone asked me to genuinely sell them on it, I'd admittedly struggle pretty hard. It's good, but definitely not great. The Faculty. This movie is extremely cringeworthy and kind of stupid, but yeah, it's also fun and entertaining, and every once in a while features some scene or idea that I really like. It's quite possibly the most dumb 90s movie I have ever seen, but yeah, it's fun, has a cool creature at the end, and might be worth your time if you drink a beer or two first. The Hidden. I think your mileage with this movie will depend on how much you enjoy the 80s style of buddy cop action movie. The Hidden is thoroughly of that lineage, and if that's your thing, you will probably love this movie. If it's not, you might struggle to enjoy it. It's still a well-made film with a compelling plot and good character dynamics, but I personally struggled to resonate with it. Deranged. This is a movie that I think starts off really strong, and kind of progressively loses steam as it goes along. Technically, everything is here. It's well acted, competently shot, has a cool, nasty parasite, and conveys a frustrating theme, but its plot is structured around a kind of roller coaster, alternating between hope for a solution and devastation at the solution's failure. This gets exhausting pretty quickly, but the movie never really figures that out. Probably worth a watch if you have nothing else to do, but just try to be patient with it. And in the low recommended tier, we have Ticks. The only reason to watch this is because of the cool tick effects, and because it's really dumb, thus being slightly funny to watch. Otherwise, I don't think there is much to like here. The Thaw. Honestly, the only reason I'd watch this is just to hear the discussion about climate extremism. Otherwise, this movie is boring and formulaic and annoying and drab. This was my least favorite movie here because it lacked anything to make me care. Okay, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this excursion into the world of parasitic horror, maybe learn something cool, have some new movies to watch, and potentially have something new to appreciate about these movies. Thank you so much for watching. This was a video that I was really excited to make. Any engagement is greatly appreciated, especially if you like long-form, analytical content like this. I hope you have a nice day. You probably shouldn't read extreme horror. It sounds dangerous. Your neighbor warned you not to. Maybe just a peek? Oh God. Oh no. When I made my first video on disturbing horror books, I had no idea it would resonate with so many fans of the genre. Honestly, I thought those books were pretty obscure, but it turns out I was tapping into a wildly passionate fan base with a lot of fantastic recommendations. Truly, my favorite part of that video was reading through the comment section and looking at all of your favorite book recommendations, especially the well thought out reviews. So today I tried to do a few of those justice. Now, I already did a longer review and critique of Playground by Aaron Beauregard, which was overwhelmingly the most discussed book in that video's comment section. So if you're interested, check that one out. And today I'll be looking at 6 more disturbing horror books that were recommended to me by y'all in the comments. And if your recommendations didn't show up here, I promise I fully intend to keep doing videos like this. The response to my horror content has been overwhelmingly positive, so don't worry, chances are it will show up soon. Here were the books I read this time, and as you'll see, they don't all fit the theme of extreme horror or splatterpunk. Full Brutal, Christopher Triana, Fluids, May Lights, The Black Farm, Elias Witherow, The Har, David Sodergren. His Pain, Wrath James White. Blender Babies, John Athan. Here are a few content warnings. As usual, I won't really discuss anything specifically, but in general, these books as a whole pretty much cover every single taboo and blasphemy. In advance, if sexual violence in particular is something you'd rather avoid, The Har is the only book I believe to be relatively safe, and self-harm is the main topic in The Black Farm. But again, all of these feature really bad stuff. As usual, I'll be reviewing and ranking these books. Now, I want to add an extra caveat today that with this batch, I really did enjoy all of these books at a minimum level. I didn't dislike anything here, so my lowest ranked book will still be something that I enjoyed. I just want to make sure that's clear. Sometimes I think people forget that these rankings are intended to be ordinal, not cardinal. After the ranking, I'll revisit my overall list of disturbing horror books and try to say roughly where these new books might fit in. Stay till the end to see that, as it will give more of a sense as to how much I enjoyed each book. Lastly, if you enjoy content like this, I would highly encourage subscribing to my channel. I mainly do videos on dark fiction and philosophy, but generally I try to make every script and video interesting and thought-provoking. Anyways, with that said, on to the reviews. Blender Babies, John Athan. Of the authors that I didn't read in the first video, John Athan seemed to be one of the most beloved. One comment sold this book to me as a father trying to get his child back during the apocalypse, which sounded pretty cool. Weirdly enough, there's apparently another book called Baby in a Blender, which I've heard maybe isn't as good. I can look into it if there's interest. Anyways, the premise of Blender Babies is absolutely insane and yeah, pretty cool. It basically takes the QAnon conspiracy theory about adrenochrome and runs with it. In this world, you can harvest adrenochrome from a baby by, well, blending it, and the adrenochrome is literally the best drug in the entire world. Like, I'm talking better than drinking a White Monster Energy. Better even than boofing Datura. Better even than Jankum. It's so horribly addictive and pleasurable that it causes a pretty quick societal collapse, akin to a zombie apocalypse, or really something more like The Road or Mad Max, where there are still locally rational power structures that hoard resources and exert control over their spheres of influence. Anyways, we open following protagonist Brian, his pregnant wife Leslie, and their son Cameron in the beginning moments of the society's collapse. It's a tense scene as nobody knows what's going on, and the baby fiends, their eventual moniker, obviously go after Leslie, but the family is able to escape. They make their way to the home of Tommy, Brian's brother, a habitual drug addict, hoping to take shelter and figure out what the hell is even going on. Brian goes into Tommy's apartment alone and discovers that Tommy has succumbed to the craze, blending a baby before his eyes. It then cuts to 9 months later as the family takes shelter in a police station with other survivors. Society has completely collapsed, and tribes of baby fiends now run the streets, while pockets of resistance are rumored to exist. I'll return to the plot in a bit, but I want to highlight how much I like this opening. It called to mind the beginnings of movies like World War Z and I Am Legend, where we are situated right alongside the characters epistemically. We don't really know what's going on, and figure it out at the same pace that they do. It's extremely tense, and I was very excited. And the beginning relied upon a key thing to create tension: family. Brian is trying to protect his wife and son, and future daughter, while also trying to save his addict brother. I'll discuss this a lot more, but Blender Babies is at its absolute best when it keeps the scale intimate, and this initial scene absolutely does that. This is especially true with Brian's brother Tommy. As you can tell, one of the book's themes or central metaphors is that of addiction. And the book is, I think, able to handle this with nuance when it keeps the scale intimate and relational. Tommy is shown to struggle morally with his addiction to the adrenochrome. It's a story about how addiction turns love and trust into a means for consumption, and overrides moral boundaries and tests familial loyalties. So yeah, I really liked the opening of the book and was intensely excited for the rest, especially because, again, the book was sold to me as a story of a man searching for his child in the apocalypse. Unfortunately, I did not enjoy the book very much until the ending. It really began to slow down for me once we were in the police station 9 months later. I just explained how the book's dynamic with Tommy shows a relatively interesting story of addiction. Well, those who've read the book might be a bit confused, because overwhelmingly, Blender Babies is not like this. Blender Babies generally feels almost like a zombie or mutant monster story. While Brian repeatedly says that baby fiends are people too, generally thinking of Tommy, their portrayal tells us otherwise. The fiends are torturous, rabid, sometimes rational, but always malicious, universally monstrous creatures. Rather than morally struggling addicts, the story flips to showing them as roving hives of maniacs. Now, I should say that there is absolutely nothing wrong with this. From what I've seen online, a lot of people really enjoy this, and that's totally cool, genuinely. But for me, I just did not find this anywhere near as interesting because it didn't utilize the book's premise as much as it could have. Rather than a super drug creating super addicts, we basically just got zombies. And starting with the police station, Blender Babies began to abandon its intimate focus and go for a sense of scale. It introduces a massive group of characters that immediately give a Walking Dead vibe. So it zooms outward from Brian's family to encompass a very large group of people. But these characters don't mean anything, save for like 3 of them that get reintroduced later. Although the ones that were actually important definitely got lost in the shuffle for me. So I began to devote mental resources trying to understand these new characters, but little did I know they weren't long for this world. Within a chapter or 2, they'd all be gone. They were completely disposable. Obviously, this highlights how dangerous the world is, but it comes at the cost of genuine character development. A lot of these people were pretty random, and I could barely separate who was who. And this was valuable page space that could have been devoted to deepening Brian, his wife Leslie, and their son Cameron. They all remain unfortunately flat and uninteresting, save for Brian at the very end of the novel. Again, this is just frustrating for me because the familial dynamic is what should have been the key source of tension in the book, but Ethan repeatedly chose to emphasize other things. But the other things he emphasized were also left underdeveloped, like with the police station full of a cast of characters that die within a chapter or 2. Of course, I didn't hate everything here, again. I still enjoyed the book quite a bit, and there were still genuinely compelling scenes even in this portion. Eventually, the police station gets raided by the baby fiends, and a mother chooses to euthanize her children rather than letting them get captured. It's heart-wrenching and effective, and again, shows that what really underlies the drama here is the familial love and connection. After the police station is sieged, Brian and his family go off on their own, and you might think that this would be a perfect opportunity to develop Leslie and Cameron, but it wasn't capitalized upon. Brian is just given solo adventures. It's sensible enough within the story to give him a solo adventure, but as the author, you can create whatever situation you want so that the story is as effective as possible, and Brian's solo excursions don't reinforce the family unit. Leslie and Cameron, and Brian and Leslie's daughter, should constitute a main source of early tension, but outside of the first chapter, they really feel like an afterthought, and that's honestly a tragedy. Basically, as I read it up until the ending sequence, Blender Babies was trying to have it 2 different ways. On one hand, it was trying to be a genuinely compelling and human story in a very bleak setting with morally struggling antagonists embodied by the likes of Tommy. This is where the theme of addiction is most centered, where the baby fiends are humanized, and where the tension arises from familial drama. On the other hand, it was trying to be an apocalyptic story of scale, like a zombie or post-nuclear mutant horror tale. People and characters are completely disposable, the enemies are absolutely monstrous, and the tension is pretty much just from mere survival. Notice how both of these are completely fine, and sometimes, though it's very, very difficult, a story can manage to have it both ways, but Blender Babies doesn't manage to do so, in my opinion. I'm confident in saying this because I really enjoyed the ending of the book, and it depended heavily on the first part. Along their journey, the family encounter a deceptive woman named Amanda, who eventually kidnaps the family's infant daughter, Harper. This causes Brian to set off on another solo quest to rescue her, again leaving Leslie and Cameron out of the book, this time basically for good, but it was fine at this point, I didn't care anymore. Along the way, Brian finally gets some much needed character development. He had gotten hints of it here and there, as he reflected on Tommy and dealt with sketchy character Amanda and whatnot, but we really didn't get a sense for who he was. And now, throughout Brian's quest, he has to do some absolutely horrific things, and his moral struggles are genuinely compelling. And spoiler alert, seriously, but the book ends in the exact same way it started. Brian faces Tommy over a baby in the blender. but this time it's Brian's daughter and Tommy's niece Harper in there, rather than some random baby. Now, if anybody was skeptical of my thematic exposition above, this little circular moment should be pretty clear. Ethan is screaming at us about the book's themes and its source of true tension. We have the book's pinnacle scene, a mirror of its opening, brother versus brother, one fighting to save a family member, one fighting off his addictive impulses. Y'all, this is compelling stuff. It's awesome. The ending capitalized on the key ideas of the book that I loved, and it really improved my opinion of the book. Because I was really struggling in the middle, I genuinely did not care about anything happening. I can't express how much Blender Babies felt like a kind of generic, albeit enhanced, zombie story. I read this book because of its premise, and I don't really care about zombie stories that much, so Blender Babies was really losing me in the middle. Luckily, this dramatic and thematic ending came along and managed to save the book from complete mediocrity. Unfortunately, Blender Babies was still pretty long, making for a bit of a chore, and I really think a lot of the middle could have been redone to better adhere to the beginning and the end to provide a more coherent experience. So while I did enjoy the book overall, it certainly wasn't my favorite of today's selection, and hence why I rank it at number 6. His Pain, Wrath James White. It seems like Wrath James White is a very prolific author in this twisted little corner of the horror genre. His books, The Bug Collector and The Resurrectionist, seem to be his most famous and most discussed, but I picked His Pain to read because it seemed the most conceptually interesting to me, and because I thought the cover was just really weird and gross and cool. I mean, behold, pretty awesome. His Pain is centered around main character Jason, starting with his very graphically described birth and following him into adolescence. But Jason isn't just any normal kid. No, his life is pretty crazy. He has an acute hypersensitive nerve disorder, which in the book means that nearly everything feels painful to him. Even silk sheets are too much for this kid. The sound of his mother's voice is like nails on a chalkboard. Everything hurts. The only solace he can find, even after extremely high dosages of opiates and other drugs, is within a kind of sensory deprivation bag. It's a miserable existence that has him wishing for death. Same, bro. His parents care for him a lot, thankfully, and his mother, on a whim, contacts a yogi who preaches physical enlightenment, a mindfulness practice that he claims can allow one to overcome pain completely. The yogi comes and teaches Jason to basically associate his constant blinding pain with overwhelming sexual pleasure. Horrific madness ensues. Now, I ranked this book at number 5, so I definitely didn't hate this book. I'd say I had like 70% of a good time with it. I'll start with the good. I enjoyed the concept of this book so much. I've been reading more into mindfulness practice a lot lately, specifically insight meditation in the Buddhist tradition. And while the yogi's teachings didn't directly reflect what I've learned in that sphere, they were instantly recognizable to me, and it filled me with such a sick, giddy joy to see something that I turn to for peace and contentment, utilized for such grotesque, monstrous purposes. It called to mind the fantasy series The Prince of Nothing, written by philosopher R. Scott Bakker, which features the character Anasarimbor Kelhus. In that series, Kelhus is a similarly enlightened character, but his thinking process is algorithmic and abstract and mechanistic, not full of Buddhistic loving kindness. So it's not the completely inverted version that His Pain presents, where the mindfulness practice leads to absolute depravity, but it does show a similar dark side of an enlightened mode of consciousness, and I really enjoy this. I think the yogi's mistake in the book is to directly substitute and associate the pain with the pleasure. As far as what I've learned, really, neither pain nor pleasure is to be truly sought or preferred. Both are to be accepted as they come, and this book shows, in extraordinarily exaggerated and monstrous fashion, what happens when pain and pleasure are mixed, Hellraiser style. And this book is monstrous, dear lord. I had taken a bit of a break from Extremity before reading this, and there's a moment right after Jason learns to associate sexual pleasure with pain, where some unspeakable, abominable, puke-inducing things occur, and I remembered then exactly why I had taken a break. I can't say I enjoyed reading these parts. It's pretty hard to enjoy them, but yeah, it's pretty unflinching, so I guess props to the author for that.
Wah!
Alright, what is good, y'all? So today we are coming back with a tier list video. And not just any tier list video. We are doing a video on the hardest drugs to fake being sober on. Because this is something I've thought about a lot as I've been dabbling. So we go through the tiers here. We just got might as well be sober, and then through D, C, B, A, and then at the top, which will be where S would be, it's just impossible. You cannot fake being sober on this drug. It's just impossible. Which this is my second recording because my OBS ran out of space, so it just stopped recording. So yeah, we're doing it again. It was shitty anyways. I wouldn't shut up, so it was just like taking up a bunch of space and whatnot. Well, it wasn't even that long. It was 10 minutes before it cut, but like the tier list wasn't even like halfway over. So anyways, so yeah, down here we have alcohol. We got caffeine, which I'm using Ghost to represent that because they're delicious. And then we got shrooms, anything containing psilocybin. Then we have lean here, which this represents codeine because I've never actually taken codeine with promethazine, which makes lean. I've just taken codeine, so that's what that is. And then we got weed right here. And then we have over-the-counter painkillers like Tylenol, ibuprofen, whatnot. And then over here we have DXM, as represented by Robocough, the best DXM source you can get. Then we got Perk 30s over here, which just represent like opioids in general. Not like fentanyl or like heroin or whatever. Those are a completely different ball game. But we're just talking like, your oxys or like hydros, Percocet, stuff like that. Then over here we have Prozac, which is just representing antidepressants. And then we have Seroquel over here, which represents antipsychotics. So, which you might think, why are antidepressants and antipsychotics on like a drug video? Which is like, yeah, no shit, they're drugs, but like they're not like psychoactive substances, right? They don't like distort your perception or whatever. They're just trying to like make you like normal essentially. But we'll get into why those are on there later. And then we have over here we got Benadryl, good old Benadryl, good old diphenhydramine, and I've dabbled a good bit with that, so I'd say I can give it a somewhat accurate rating. And then over here, I didn't really know what to do for this one. This is supposed to be Amanita muscaria, but the only thing I took with Amanita muscaria in it are these gummies right here, these road trip gummies that have been going around. And I don't know. I think I'm pretty sure there was other stuff in there. I'm pretty sure it was Amanita muscaria and Kana, which because it made me extremely happy. Like I was getting kind of a psychedelic vibe. Like it was kind of subtle, but then I felt extremely happy, like I was on Molly. And I've heard people say Kana is like Molly. So that's this is just the road trip gummies essentially. I'm just rating them. This isn't really a broad category. It's just the road trip gummies for me. But yeah. And then over here we have nitrous. So, which I don't know like how to rank it because like the immediate effects are way different than the lingering effects. So, but I'm gonna say, or pretty much for all these drugs, is like you take it and then after you're done taking it, so like no one sees the substance, they just see how it affects you, and that's how you can like get away with it or not. Because like obviously if they see you doing it, they're not gonna get away with being sober. So, anyways, so yeah, nitrous. I guess we'll do the lingering effects of that, cause like I mean you probably still like have the shit in your hand or next to you if you're still feeling the immediate effects. So like you're never gonna take nitrous and then like go out and someone's gonna be like, oh, what the fuck are you on, you know? So yeah, anyways, let's get right into it. We'll start with alcohol. So we're not just talking like a light dose or whatever. We're not just talking like one shot, one beer or whatever. This is a moderate dose for all of these. So I'm thinking with alcohol, maybe it should be so this would be like fairly drunk. Like you're not really drunk, but you're fairly drunk. Not just a little drunk. You're fairly drunk. You're like, all right, shit's getting real, you know. So I'm thinking maybe B tier. I'd say because it's when you're drunk, it's pretty obvious. Like you don't like it's very discernible from like different substances or whatever. You can tell people like talk a certain way, you know. It's like very obvious, especially with how like normalized alcohol is. So I think if you're fairly drunk, if you're good about it, if you're like maybe you're used to it, I'd say maybe B tier. Not very impossible, but like you're getting up there. It's not super easy. And then with caffeine, I'm gonna say you might, which this would be like 200 to 300 milligrams or something like that. And I say you might as well be sober. Like, yeah, if you take a high dose, so like you're not used to it, you like chug an energy drink, then yeah, you might be tweaking a little bit, and like that's obvious. But honestly, whenever I've been tweaking like on caffeine or whatever, which it's only really happened to me like once or twice, no one really said anything. It was mostly like me that was noticing it. But yeah, on a normal moderate dose or whatever, you're just like really high energy, really focused, you might as well be sober. There's no real giveaways that you're on something. So, and then on to, unlike psilocybin, so which it's hard to say for psilocybin because the highest dose I've taken is an eighth, and I'd say it was very obvious. It was pretty obvious I wasn't sober, but it's hard to rank. Well, like is an eighth a moderate dose? I don't really know. I feel like a moderate dose would be like maybe 2 to 3 grams. I think once you get to 3 to 4 to 5, that's when it starts being like a higher dose, especially with no tolerance. So I say a little bit below an eighth, like maybe 2 to 3 grams would be about a moderate dose for me. And whenever I take on 2 to 3 grams, which I took because I took 2 grams like the other day, and like I managed it pretty well. And I was on weed and some other stuff, so like the effects were amplified, and I handled it pretty well, I'd say. Like I was able to like go about my day fine or whatever. Completely different experience from taking an 8. But again, 2 grams isn't a microdose, so I'd say 2 grams is about a moderate dose. You know, you're feeling shit's kind of breathing, you know, like the walls are breathing and whatnot. So I'd say on a moderate dose, easier than maybe because it's a different kind of you know, having to fake being sober whenever you're on shrooms versus like something like alcohol. So I think maybe a C tier for now, because like my balance is a lot better when you're on a psychedelic versus, which you may like look a little weird and you may talk a little weird on shrooms, but I mean you'll talk weird on alcohol as well. So like the only real giveaway is like if someone looks at your eyes, you're kind of fucked. But yeah, I'm gonna go C tier for now. I think that's because alcohol inebriates your body, and that's like the biggest giveaway that you're really high on something is like your body movements. Because if you're like stumbling around into shit, you know, then that's like the biggest giveaway, I think. And then also the way that you talk or whatever. But like this is assuming like you're going out in public and you like have an interaction with somebody, like, or even if you're not going out in public, like let's say you interact with like your roommate or like your siblings or your parents or something like that. What are they gonna think is essentially what this tier list is. So but I will say I do get really smiley off shrooms, and you know when you smile, people know you're on up to something. So I don't know. We'll go okay, maybe a B tier. We'll go B tier. I think it's a little behind alcohol, but then again, I haven't gotten really drunk before, so. But I've gotten a little drunk, but not very drunk. Not what I consider like a moderately like drunk dose. But anyways, on to codeine. Now, codeine, I think it should be. I think you might as well be sober on this one, honestly. Well, not to the extent of caffeine though. It's like, okay, if you take a because whenever I took a light dose, I didn't take a moderate dose. But I remember I just felt kind of glued to my chair or whatever. Like I was playing a video game. I was playing Xenoblade, and I like didn't even feel like playing the game anymore. I just wanted to like slump, but I could still move around and fine. I wasn't like, I didn't feel like my movement was impeded anyway. So I think we'll do it above caffeine though, cause like it's not on the same level as caffeine. Caffeine is definitely a lot easier to fake being sober. Which caffeine, it's fucking legal. You wouldn't even be in that situation anyways. But again, might as well be sober. And so I think it's a little bit above that. And then we have weed. So weed, personally, I think weed is it's kind of obvious. There's a lot of telltale signs. One is the smell, but I don't smoke like actual weed. I just use like cards or vapes or whatnot. So that's what my frame of reference is from. So when it comes to those, I'd say if you're smoking normal weed, then it's like, okay, you will smell like it, your eyes will be red, and then you'll be acting high. So I think if you smoke like a good amount of normal weed, then it's impossible. Like they will know, especially unless you're around someone that knows absolutely jack shit about drugs. But if you're on like an average person, then they will know it's impossible. However, when it comes to carts and vapes and stuff, that shit's subtle nowadays or whatever. And if you've gotten used to being high, you know, like what people are looking out for, you know, you can kind of act pretty normal. So it's weird. I think I'm more inebriated on weed than shrooms. I'm gonna be honest, because shrooms just makes me like think differently, but weed makes me fucking stupid. Like I'll walk in one room and I'll just forget what the fuck I'm doing. Like I do, and it's not like sometimes that happens. It's every time that I do that. If I try to keep something on my mind, it is gone. So it's like hard to hold a conversation or whatnot if you're pretty baked. Then it makes my body movements kind of rough as well. And then like I get really hungry, like, and I don't really eat much normally, but when I'm on weed, dude, I get the fucking munchies. I eat a shit ton. So that's another telltale sign. And then obviously, you know, your eyes go red. So I'm gonna say, I think it's an A. I think it's an A, honestly, because like it's pretty obvious. If you're pretty baked, like if you're on a moderate dose, I'd say it's fairly obvious, but not impossible. I've gotten away with it several times. Actually, I don't even think I've gotten like suspicious on, because weed, I'm more careful about weed because like I know how obvious it looks. So I'm gonna say A tier. I think it is an A tier, to be honest, but maybe I'll change that as this goes on. I don't know. Anyways, up next we got the over-the-counter painkillers. Now this is your Tylenol, ibuprofen, you know, whatever the fuck it says here. So these, I mean, they might as well be like sugar pills, to be honest. Like to me, even for their like pain relief effects, I don't even really notice it, to be honest. So but yeah, that'll make you act any differently, and I don't really notice any side effects either. So we'll put that in caffeine. Honestly, we'll put that. Well, no, technically it'd be behind, because like the lower the list goes, the less, the more sober you look. So I guess the most sober stuff will be over here, but you won't notice shit from it, and no one else will. So now we're on to an over-the-counter dissociative, which is DXM. Now this is a fun one. Okay, like when I first started taking DXM, like, because that was one of the first drugs I ever tried. This was my gateway drug, as stupid as it sounds. And like I was taking pretty low doses. I was taking like 60 to like 90 milligrams or whatever, which is like less than a Plat 1 dose for me. Which, if you don't know, the different levels of DXM, you got the Plat 1, Plat 2, Plat 3, Plat 4, which are different plateaus. And those are basically the different levels of getting high. Each level produces different effects, but past level 4, you're just experiencing the same effects, just more. You're just like more dissociated. So yeah, a Plat 1 is like considered like, okay, that's the starting point. And I was taking like less than that, which would be considered more than a therapeutic dose, but like still, it was enough to get me right or whatever. But nowadays, like a moderate dose for me, I think is like a second plateau dose, or like a low second plateau dose. I'd say that's a moderate dose. That's like the middle ground. That's the point to where you can be around other people, and you need to stay in your room with like the lights off and like in your bed or whatever. So I would say, you know, if you're on that edge or whatever, I'm gonna put it in C tier, because I know I can handle it, and I can fake being sober pretty well. There's one, like, I'm gonna say what it was. I don't want to give it away to people that may know me that watch this, but like there was a certain family gathering that I took I downed a children's bottle of Delsim, and this is when I'm pretty sure I had zero tolerance or whatever, and I was high for 3 days, but because Delsim isn't just because right here this is freebase DXM, but Delsim is DXM Polisterex, which is like the extended release version of it. So it lasted for longer, but it was also like half the strength as well. So I took 444 milligrams, I think, which translates to about 222 milligrams of like regular DXM. So it was about a low second plateau dose. So I don't know how, but I managed to fake being sober. Everyone just thought I was having a really good time. You know, so it doesn't inebriate you in the same way weed does. It's more close to an opioid like high, I'd say. But which brings me into the next one, opioids. So right here we got Percocet, Perc 30s. But yeah, this goes for like Percocet, Vicodin, morphine, any of those, like any opioids that are in that range. And I'd say that these, honestly, now okay, this is considering like the best possible situation you can go for. This is the like essentially the best you can hope for. Like yeah, you could like someone can tell you're high on opiates or whatever if they like know what to look for and if you're not trying to hide it. But like if you do your best job, I think you might as well be sober. Now hear me out. Opioids are considered like a pretty hard drug or whatever, and so it's the hardest drug that I've tried. But the thing is, it doesn't really inebriate you very much. You can walk around fine. In fact, I can perform, cause you know my channel is about like, I tried to be about like flipping and like doing extreme sports and whatnot. There was one time I went to the trampoline park. I was off 2 hydros, and I performed fine. In fact, I was probably doing better than I normally did, to be honest, because like I wasn't feeling really any of the pain, which is the drawback, which is why you shouldn't do sports on painkillers, because you will feel the pain twice as much the next day, because I was starting to feel the pain towards the end of my session, which is why I started to slow down a bit, which means my pain was like catching up to me. So I was already hurting before then, I just couldn't feel it because of the fucking opioids. But yeah, I functioned fine. I performed really well. Does not inebriate your body. And the thing is, it makes your body feel good, right? That's like the main appeal, and like it makes for a nice headspace as well. But like it doesn't make you fucking like stupid or whatever, and also it doesn't inebriate your body in any way. So I think you might as well be sober on them if you play your cards right. And this is like, let's say you take 10 to 15 milligrams of like Percocet. If you're taking upwards of like 30 or something like that with like no tolerance or anything higher than that, then it's like okay, yeah, then people will probably know something's up. But if you're taking a moderate dose, just like a normal dose, then you're chilling, honestly. I think so. But anyways, now we go to Prozac. Now, most people, unless you've been on antidepressants, you probably don't know this, but it actually does kind of make you high. It's kind of like an opioid high, but like a very subtle opioid high, like 3 milligrams of oxycodone maybe. I remember whenever I first started taking it, I started out with Zoloft, and it made my body feel good, kind of like an opioid would, and it made my grip strength very low. So like, and also sometimes I would like run into things, which I don't think it's a placebo effect. It could be, but I don't know. I don't think it is. Assuming it's not a placebo effect, I'll put Prozac. Well, the thing is, if I try, because it's not like I wasn't supposed to be on them. They were my medication I was prescribed for, so I didn't need to like fake being sober on them. So I would say if you're not trying to fake being sober on it, then it would be up here. But it's easy to fake being sober on it. It's a walk in the park. But I feel like it was worthy mention, just because of how fucking just because it makes you feel it kind of feels like an opioid, honestly, but obviously less. So we'll put opioids like up here or whatever, and then there we go. All right. So now another questionable choice on the list, we have Seroquel, which is an antipsychotic. Now, okay, so the thing is with antipsychotics, like then if you take it during the daytime, then that likely means you're on a lower dose, so not enough to cause like heavy sedation or anything. And the biggest effect of that, which for me, whenever I was on both Seroquel and Abilify, or I think maybe just Abilify, like it makes you extremely restless. It gives you something called akathisia, which is it's just a fancy word for like a state of intense restlessness. And so when you're doing that, you're tweaking. It gave me like at least 2 panic attacks, I think, while I was on Abilify. So then they switched me to Seroquel at night, and it makes you restless for like the first 30 minutes to an hour before you inevitably fall asleep. But if you're on a low dose and you're just taking it like that, it's fine. However, when you get into the higher doses, which I was later prescribed, they started upping my dose, and then it got to the point where it was 300 milligrams, which is a pretty fucking high dose of Seroquel. The highest dose they make of Seroquel is 400 milligrams, and the highest dose they make of the off-label, I think the generic is quetiapine. I think that's the actual name of it. But the highest dose they make of the off-label stuff is 800 milligrams. So, and that's for people who have a crazy high tolerance, and like 400 milligrams isn't working for them anymore, so they need 500. And the 500 stops working like it should, so then they move up a little bit. Realistically, assuming you have no tolerance, I don't care like how much of an insomniac you are, like you really don't need more than 100. But anyways, once you start getting to these crazy high doses, it starts acting kind of like as a deliriant, but it's a little bit different. It's an atypical deliriant. It's not a typical deliriant like diphenhydramine, for example, Benadryl, or Datura, or doxylamine, something like that. It makes you like you kind of go off, or for me at least, it makes you like kind of go off into your own head and you start getting like delirious. Like if you're trying to interact with someone like who's like there with you in front of you, like you'll be pretty stupid. You're like your short-term memory will be really bad. You'll be non-responsive, and if you open your eyes, you kind of like see shit flying around. Like it looks like air mites are like flying around everywhere. If you close your eyes, it kind of looks like your vision is like an astronaut, like an astronaut's helmet. That's like what your vision looks like, if that makes sense. It kind of looks like you're in space, but like in a nightmarish kind of way. So, and I had a recently bad experience after I was off Seroquel, because it kept giving me nightmarish delirium before I'd go to bed, and I didn't like that, obviously. So I switched to mirtazapine. But then recently, I wanted to take Seroquel again because I still have some left. I wanted to compare it. So that was a big mistake because I had 0 tolerance and I took 300 milligrams. So what happened was after like I started getting a genuine feeling of dysphoria, and then like shit started like hitting the fan, and then I was kind of getting nightmarish vibes, and I was kind of getting a little delirious, and I was like, okay, just go to bed, and like the more it set in, the more heavy my body felt and whatnot. So then I activated sleep paralysis, which was fucking horrible. So like there was like shadow people in the room and whatnot, and I couldn't do anything about it, and I had like 3 or 4 different like false awakenings. So yeah, there was a bunch of crazy shit. I'll say that story for another video, but like essentially I couldn't wake up, and every time I thought I woke up, I didn't. And then there was like shadow people grabbing me and like dragging me places or whatever, and I could actually feel them. The thing is with diphenhydramine or whatever, the delusions aren't the hallucinations. They don't ever touch you. You can never feel them. You might feel like bugs crawling on you or like bugs biting you, but the hallucinations you see don't interact with you. But since I was induced with sleep paralysis from the Seroquel, anything was on the table. So it was just horrible. It was a totally nightmarish experience. So that's why if you went out in the public or you try to interact with someone on that, I would say it isn't possible to fake being sober. Someone will probably call for help for you, and like you'd end up in a psych ward, which is ironic because it's a fucking antipsychotic. But I don't know what's up with that. Which they prescribe that to people with fucking like schizophrenia or like bipolar or whatnot, which it's a sedative, and I get I'm pretty sure that's what is supposed to stop people from being psychotic and whatnot, but I don't know. Anyways, yeah, Seroquel way fucking up there. This is assuming you take a moderate, which 300 milligrams, I don't think that's fair to say it's a moderate dose. I say that's on the higher end of a moderate dose, but because they start you at like 25 or 50 milligrams. But just because of my bad experience, and I fucking hate Seroquel now, which I never really liked it in the first place, but yeah, we're throwing that up there. And next we have Benadryl, another deliriant, which technically this isn't a deliriant, but it's anticholinergic at these high levels, which is what makes things a deliriant. So I'm considering it a fucking deliriant. And now we have diphenhydramine. Now, It's in the same boat. It's a fucking delirium. The body load is absolutely insane on DPH. The only difference is that, for me at least, whenever you're taking high doses or any dose, it doesn't make me sleepy. I've tried taking low doses of it, and same things with doxylamine, which is another antihistamine sleep med, and they don't do shit for me. But when I'm taking high doses, I especially, like, even when my body feels like I can't move it, I don't feel sleepy whatsoever. So your body will feel like you're 1,000 pounds whenever you take DPH, or I'm assuming any delirium. Like, and that's not an exaggeration. You will literally feel like you weigh 1,000 pounds if you take a moderate dose, which is like about 100 to 500 milligrams, and you just feel like you weigh more and more the more you take. It's actually crazy. It's, and like your knees will start to wobble, like you're folding on your own weight, which is crazy. And on top of that, if you try to talk to someone, you will be speaking absolute nonsense. You will be saying things, it doesn't make any sense. I've seen recordings of people, like my brother recorded me once while I was tripping on it, and it was very disturbing, honestly. It's extremely obvious. Which, if you're on 300 milligrams or less, there's a slim chance you can get away with it. But 300 to 500 milligrams, you're fucked. And keep in mind, whenever I took it, I was on antidepressants, which I later found out dulled the experience a bit. So I was able to take 700, like upwards of 700 to 800 milligrams and still be like, which I was delirious for sure, but I was still like somewhat coherent or whatever. So I didn't go into full-blown delirium like a lot of people would. And I don't even weigh much. I weigh like 130, I think. So anyways, so yeah. You know, oh no, also your memory will be fucking ass. So, and you won't be able to move. And also, another thing that was happening to me, I forgot, another side effect, is your mouth will be tweaking. Like, for what a lot of people say is that their mouth gets really dry, but for me, it wasn't only that, it was also, like, I would start, like, moving my jaw and tongue in, like, really weird ways, and, like, and my memory was so shot that whenever I tried to correct it, I would just forget about it, and then I just keep doing it. So, like, imagine, you know, you're sitting in bed, you can't move, your mouth is dry as fuck, you're delirious, you're hallucinating, and then on top of that, you're forgetting everything as it's happening. So if someone walks in and sees you on that, there's nothing you can fucking do. You can try to act sober. It doesn't, the first sentence you speak to someone, they'll automatically assume you're on something. There's no getting out of it. It is impossible. And then now we can move on to the two that I don't really know what to do with, but, so this is Amanita muscaria, and it also, which on the back, I think it says lion's mane mushroom plus secret nootropic proprietary blend. I think that's what it says. So, secret proprietary blend, I don't know what the fuck that could mean. That could be anything. What I'm assuming it's Amanita muscaria because it felt kind of psychedelic. However, the medicine that I was on at the time, even though I took a fairly high dose of it, I took 6 of the gummies and there's only 8 in the thing. And it felt kind of psychedelic, you know, colors were enhanced. I kind of felt like a general sense of everything moving, but like I couldn't really see it moving when I focused on it. It kind of felt like everything was like breathing a little bit, like, but I couldn't really see it moving. But like it was a little psychedelic, it was a little trippy. And I've heard from other people that they described it, they're like, yeah, it's pretty much like a low dose of psilocybin. So, anyways, so yeah, I was on the medicine I'm still on right now when I took it, which is mirtazapine, which blocks the same receptor that like psychedelics agonize. So, which essentially means it cancels out the effects, which ultimately dulls the visuals. It doesn't dull the other stuff. It doesn't dull the headspace and it doesn't dull the body load, but it does dull the visuals. But for me personally, we're just gonna rank the road trip gummies because it's not fair to just say Amanita muscaria because it made me really fucking happy. And people say Kana is kind of like Molly, and it made me feel how people describe Molly because I never tried it. Obviously, it'd be on here if I did. But yeah, I could not stop smiling, and the come down was really rough. I felt extremely depressed. So, with that being said, I think it's on the level of weed. Like, although I think it's ahead of weed, cause I don't know. I feel like I could fake being sober more on. I don't know. Cause okay, technically I took on the higher end dose. I didn't take a medium dose. I guess a medium dose would be like, well, it fucking says it on here. Moderate dose is 2 to 3 gummies. Okay, and then a high dose is 5 to 6. Okay, so technically I took a high dose. So okay, it's probably on the same level of psilocybin mushrooms, I think. Although I feel like because it has Kana in it, it's on that same level. If it didn't, then, well, I don't know. It's hard. I think maybe DXM, but like ahead of DXM. I think that's fair. Yeah, sure. Why not? I don't know. This whole list is an estimate. Like after, like these are for sure skis, and then these are for sure skis. In the middle, it's kind of like, it's kind of a gray area. But, anyways, let's move on to our final edition, which is Nitrous. Now, Nitrous, I'm only going to refer to the link.
Time to travel back in time. Number 10, diphtheria. You are in Bergen, Norway, and the year is 1883, and the air inside the physician's examination room is thick with the smell of tallow candles and damp wool. A 6-year-old girl sits on a wooden chair, her mother gripping her small hand, both of them watching the doctor's face for any sign of reassurance. The doctor finds none to give, because what he sees at the back of the child's throat stops every clinical instinct he possesses cold. Coating her pharynx is a thick, leathery, grayish-white membrane. Not pus, not swelling, not any inflammation he has been trained to recognize, but something almost architectural in its terrible construction. It is spreading as he watches. It is tightening around her airway like a slow, deliberate hand. The child cannot swallow without wincing, and by the following morning, she will barely be able to breathe. The medical paradigm of 1883 holds that throat infections are local problems, manageable with rest, poultices, and the body's own recuperative powers. Germ theory, championed through the 1860s and 1870s by Pasteur and Koch, is still bitterly contested in clinical circles across Europe, its implications only partially absorbed into daily medical practice. Most physicians still carry a quiet, residual belief in miasma, the idea that bad air rising from filth and poverty is the true engine of disease. What no one in that Bergen room can possibly understand is that the real killer is not the bacteria visible in that gray membrane at all. The true agent of death is an invisible protein molecule, a toxin so perfectly engineered by Corynebacterium diphtheria that it has been doing exactly this, choking, paralyzing, and killing for an estimated 60,000 to 100,000 years of human prehistory. The ancient world called it the strangling angel of children, and the name was not poetry. It was a diagnosis born from helpless, repeated observation across every generation that ever lived. On December 11, 1883, in Berlin, Friedrich Loeffler, a bacteriologist working inside Robert Koch's laboratory, successfully isolates and cultures Corynebacterium diphtheria from a diphtheria patient's throat membrane. And the moment he examines his results, something deeply unsettling becomes apparent. Working with a novel staining technique under a Zeiss compound microscope, Loeffler observes that the bacteria congregate almost exclusively at the surface of the membrane, clustered near the mucosa, never migrating deeper into tissue. Yet the damage, the nerve destruction, the cardiac paralysis, the cascading systemic collapse happening simultaneously in the patient's body is occurring everywhere, in organs the bacteria never reach. Loeffler documents this dissociation with meticulous precision across multiple specimens, cross-referencing his findings with patient clinical records, and his laboratory notes describe what he calls a wandering poison, a substance secreted by the bacteria that travels through the blood as an independent agent of destruction. The scientific establishment dismisses him with the particular confidence that establishments reserve for ideas that threaten their foundations. It takes another 8 years until 1888 for Émile Roux and Alexandre Yersin at the Pasteur Institute in Paris to prove the toxin's existence by injecting bacteria-free filtrate into guinea pigs and watching them develop and die from identical symptoms. The room is reportedly silent when the results are confirmed, the kind of silence that follows something irreversible. For the first time in the history of medicine, a molecule, not a living organism, has been identified as the primary architect of death, and the implications radiate outward like a shockwave through every assumption the medical world holds about how disease actually works. Loeffler, vindicated, but still marginal, continues his work. The strangling angel, meanwhile, continues its work too. Diphtheria toxin is a 5-35 amino acid protein encoded not by the bacterium's own genome, but by a bacteriophage, a virus that infects the bacterium itself, meaning Corynebacterium diphtheria only becomes a killer when it is itself infected by something smaller. The toxin operates by catalytically inactivating elongation factor 2, the molecular machinery that drives protein synthesis in human cells, and a single molecule of diphtheria toxin is sufficient to kill a single human cell, a ratio of lethality with almost no parallel in the biological world. A 2019 study published in Nature Communications identified Corynebacterium diphtheria, genomic markers in dental calculus samples from Bronze Age skeletal remains in Germany and Siberia, dating the bacterium's human association to at least 5,000 years ago, with evolutionary modeling suggesting the toxin encoding phage integration occurred between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. Early theories proposing fungal causation were ruled out by Loeffler's pure culture isolations in 1883. The idea that exposure conferred reliable immunity was partially dismantled when the toxin's mechanism proved wildly inconsistent in producing natural immune responses. The hypothesis that the membrane itself was the primary suffocation mechanism was overturned when cardiac paralysis was confirmed as the dominant cause of death, even in patients with non-obstructive infections. A safe and effective vaccine has existed since 1923, developed by Gaston Ramon at the Pasteur Institute. Yet, WHO data for 2023 records approximately 8,000 clinical diphtheria cases globally, concentrated in countries where vaccine coverage has collapsed below the critical 85% threshold required for herd protection. In Yemen, a catastrophic outbreak between 2017 and 2019 killed hundreds of children in a country whose healthcare infrastructure had been destroyed by war, proving that the strangling angel does not need the past to return. It only needs the present to fail. The most chilling implication of everything Loeffler, Roux, and Yersin discovered is not what the toxin does to a single cell, but what Corynebacterium diphtheria does when no one is watching, maintaining a persistent, non-toxigenic reservoir in human populations worldwide, waiting in throats, waiting in communities, waiting with the patience of something that has already outlasted every civilization it has ever encountered, and wondering, perhaps, which one it will outlast next. Number 9. Trachoma. You are standing at the edge of the Nile Delta, and the year is approximately 1500 BCE, and the light is enormous and merciless, hammering down onto the reed beds and the brown water and the faces of the people moving between them. A scribe, a learned man with ink-stained fingers and a privileged position in the administrative hierarchy of the most powerful civilization on Earth, is struggling to read the papyrus stretched across his lap. His eyes are red, deeply and persistently red, and they have been that way for weeks. He rubs them instinctively, pressing the heel of his palm against the burning conjunctiva, which is precisely the worst thing he can do, though no knowledge available to him or to any physician in his world would tell him so. Inside his eyelids, invisible to any examination possible in 1500 BCE, microscopic inflammatory follicles are forming along the conjunctival surface, small hard nodules building in rows like terrible architecture. Slowly, without pain dramatic enough to command attention, they are transforming the inner surface of his eyelids into a textured, abrasive surface. Every blink drags that roughened tissue across the delicate corneal epithelium. Every single blink, every moment of every waking hour, is carving another microscopic scar into the window of his vision. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 BCE, contains the earliest known written description of this disease and its copper-based remedies. Copper being marginally antimicrobial by modern understanding, though the Egyptians could not have known why it sometimes helped. What they did know, encoded in the papyrus with the weary precision of people who had seen this many times, was that the disease progressed, that it worsened, and that it eventually took the eyes. The bacterium responsible, Chlamydia trachomatis, had been infecting human eyes since before Homo sapiens existed as a distinct species. The paradigm for those 3,400 years between the Ebers Papyrus and the 20th century was one of geographic fatalism. Trachoma was the price of dust, heat, poverty, and flies, an environmental inevitability rather than a defeatable enemy. That belief kept it invisible, even as it dismantled the vision of hundreds of millions of people across every generation of recorded history. The decisive scientific breakthrough arrives on July 17, 1907 in Berlin, where Ludwig Halberstädter and Stanislaus von Proazek are examining conjunctival scrapings from trachoma patients under oil immersion microscopy at 1,000 times magnification, using a modified Giemsa staining technique that had only recently been refined for this kind of cellular work. What they see inside the epithelial cells of the conjunctiva
A wild
makes
Manectric
them
appears
lean
captured
closer
using Poke
and then
Catch.
stay
Winners
leaning,
revealed in 90s.
because the structures they are looking at do not belong to any category of pathogen yet formally described. There are strange, clustered inclusion bodies packed within the host cells, not free-floating bacteria, not the signatures of a virus as then understood, but something occupying an unnerving biological middle ground, an obligate intracellular parasite incapable of surviving outside a living cell. They call these structures chlamydozoa and publish immediately in the Archiv für Schiffs und Tropenhygiene, and the medical establishment receives the finding with the particular mixture of fascination and resistance that greets discoveries that refuse to fit existing frameworks. It takes decades for the clinical implications to move from the laboratory into the field, and when WHO research teams finally conduct systematic surveys across sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia in the 1950s, what they find in a single village in Ethiopia's Amhara region is so extreme, it strains the language of scientific reporting. Every person in the community is infected. Not most of them, not a concerning proportion. Every single person, from the youngest children showing active follicular inflammation, to the adults with trichiasis, eyelashes turned inward, scraping the cornea with every
Manectric
blink,
escaped. No one
to
caught
the
it.
elderly who are simply, quietly, irreversibly blind. Field researchers document the findings with the controlled professional language of trained observers, and then, in their private notes and letters, something raw comes through. This has been happening here for generations, and no one outside this valley knew. The disease had been hiding, not in obscurity, but in the assumption that blindness among the rural poor was simply one of the ordinary textures of poverty, unremarkable, unrecorded, and therefore uncounted. Chlamydia trachomatis, serovars A, B, BA, and C infect conjunctival epithelial cells and trigger repeated inflammatory cycles that produce scarring called cicatricial trachoma, which distorts the eyelid architecture in a condition known as entropia and drives the eyelashes inward in trichiasis, and over 10 to 15 years of repeated reinfection, gradually destroys corneal transparency through progressive opacity. The entire process is largely painless in its early stages, which is precisely what makes it so catastrophically effective, because populations living with early stage infection have no urgent clinical signal compelling them to seek care. They often cannot access anyway. According to the 2023 WHO Global Report on Neglected Tropical Diseases, approximately 1.9 million people are irreversibly blind or visually impaired from trachoma, with 125 million people living in areas requiring active intervention across 44 endemic countries. A 2015 study in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology confirmed trachoma-consistent orbital bone lesion patterns in pre-Columbian South American mummies, establishing a global prehistoric distribution predating any recorded contact between the Old and New Worlds. Early theories attributing the disease exclusively to fly transmission were ruled out when flies were confirmed as mechanical vectors spreading bacterial load between faces, not the causative agent themselves. The hypothesis that antibiotic treatment alone would eliminate trachoma was repeatedly overturned by field data showing reinfection rates in endemic communities remaining stubbornly high without simultaneous improvements in facial hygiene and environmental sanitation. The claim that the disease was climatically constrained to hot, arid regions was dismantled by documented cases among Arctic indigenous communities in Canada. The WHO SAFE strategy, combining surgery, antibiotics, facial cleanliness, and environmental improvement, has been official policy since 1993, and 30 years of sustained global effort have made genuine progress. And yet in Ethiopia alone, over 40 million people remain at risk of a disease whose mechanism was first described on a papyrus before the Iron Age began. Perhaps the question that should haunt us is not how a bacterium this ancient has survived this long, but how we built a world sophisticated enough to map the human genome, and still cannot guarantee a child in Amhara will wake tomorrow without something slowly, silently stealing the light from their eyes. Number 8. Typhus. You are outside the walls of Granada, Spain, and the year is 1489, and the combined armies of Ferdinand and Isabella are encamped in a siege that should, by every strategic calculation available to their commanders, succeed. The army is vast, disciplined, and well provisioned. The greatest military force the Iberian Peninsula has assembled in a generation. Poised at the final campaign of the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to reclaim the last Moorish stronghold on Spanish soil. And then, in the heat of late summer, men begin to fall, not from arrows, not from swords, not from the calculated violence of war, but from a fever that arrives without warning and moves through encampments with a speed that terrifies veterans who have survived every conventional horror of medieval warfare. The sick develop a rash of dark, spreading blotches across their torsos, their skin mottled and bruised looking, their eyes bloodshot and glassy, their minds sliding into delirium within days of first symptoms. The stench rising from the camp is beyond anything the surgeons have experienced, and they have experienced much. 17,000 soldiers die before Granada falls, not to Moorish resistance, but to a disease no one can name, no one can explain, and no one can stop. The paradigm within which every physician and military surgeon of 1489 operates holds that disease is the inevitable companion of armies, caused by the corruption of air around large concentrations of men and filth, manageable only through dispersal and prayer. What none of them can conceive is that the true killer is Rickettsia prowazekii, a microscopic bacterium carried in the feces of body lice living in the seams of soldiers' clothing, an organism that has been exploiting human filth and the warmth of human bodies since the Paleolithic. Since humans first began living in groups large and close enough to sustain a louse population across seasons. Typhus would go on to kill more human beings than most military conflicts in history, reshaping the outcomes of wars from the Italian campaigns of the 16th century to Napoleon's catastrophic 1812 Russian campaign, where more French soldiers died of typhus than were killed by Russian forces, to the Eastern Front of the First World War, where the disease killed more men than combat. The strangling grip of this ancient bacterium on the fate of nations operated for 4 centuries after Granada, and no one, not a single military commander or court physician in all of Europe, understood what was actually killing their armies. The investigative breakthrough that cracks typhus open arrives not in a dramatic laboratory confrontation, but in a corridor observation so elegantly simple, it seems almost too quiet for the magnitude of what it reveals. On June 27, 1909, in Tunis, Charles Nicole, director of the Pasteur Institute of Tunis, is standing in the hospital and watching typhus patients move through the building's intake process. And he notices something that has been hiding in plain procedural sight. Patients arriving at the front door, passing through the crowded waiting rooms, are infecting other patients and hospital staff with terrible efficiency. But patients admitted to the wards, stripped of their clothing, bathed, and dressed in clean hospital gowns, transmit nothing to anyone after that point. Transmission stops at the bathing room. Nicole stands in the corridor and methodically eliminates every variable available to him, running the logic forward and backward until the conclusion arrives with cold, irreversible clarity. Whatever transmits typhus lives on the patient's clothing and body surface and is removed by bathing, and the only organism that fits that profile is the body louse. Working with Ernest Conseil and Charles Comte, Nicole performs transmission experiments using chimpanzees, confirming louse-mediated transmission within a year, and publishes in the Comptes Rendus de l'Académie des Sciences in 1910, earning the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1928 for one of the most consequential deductive observations in the history of public health. In 2006, a team publishing in Emerging Infectious Diseases reports the identification of Rickettsia prowazekii DNA in dental pulp extracted from a 400-year-old skeleton recovered from a mass grave in Douai, France, consistent with a documented 16th century typhus outbreak, placing the organism at the scene of historical atrocities with molecular precision. The discovery of the Brill-Zinsser phenomenon adds an even more disturbing dimension. A patient infected in 1944 can experience a full clinical recurrence of typhus in 1972 without any new exposure, because Rickettsia prowazekii lies dormant in lymph nodes indefinitely, reactivating when immune surveillance falters. Nicole's elegant corridor observation saved millions of lives, and yet the organism he identified has never truly retreated. Rickettsia prowazekii is an obligate intracellular gram-negative bacterium that infects the endothelial cells lining blood vessels throughout the body, triggering vasculitis, microvascular leakage, and cascading multi-organ failure, with a case fatality rate ranging from 10 to 40% without antibiotic treatment, dropping below 1% with doxycycline. Additional phylogenetic studies place the evolutionary roots of Rickettsia species at least 150 million years ago, with the specific human louse Rickettsia triad forming during the Paleolithic in conditions of overcrowding and compromised sanitation, conditions that have never permanently disappeared from human experience. Early miasma-based explanations were definitively ruled out by Nicole's transmission experiments in 1909. The persistent confusion between typhus and typhoid fever, two entirely distinct diseases with overlapping nomenclature, delayed accurate epidemiological tracking for decades until mid-19th century serology confirmed them as separate organisms with entirely different mechanisms. The hypothesis that typhus had been functionally eliminated by the mid-20th century was destroyed by a 1997 outbreak in Burundi that infected 100,000 people in refugee camps in a matter of months, demonstrating that the disease requires not evolution or adaptation, but simply the right conditions. The same conditions that produced the mass graves of Grenada and the frozen corpses of Napoleon's retreating soldiers. According to ongoing WHO surveillance data, epidemic typhus remains endemic in parts of Africa, South America, and Central Asia, and body louse infestations are increasing globally among homeless and displaced populations in ways that public health systems in wealthy countries are only beginning to monitor with appropriate alarm. The body louse does not need poverty to be romantic or historical. It needs only a body and a gap in the systems designed to protect it. Perhaps what is most unsettling about typhus is not what it did to armies and empires, but the quiet arithmetic of the present. The louse is still here, the bacterium is still here, and somewhere right now, in a camp or a city or a corridor, the conditions that unleash them are assembling themselves again. Number 7. Hepatitis B. You are in a small, smoke-darkened Bronze Age settlement in what is now Bavaria, Germany, and the year is approximately 2800 BCE, and the man sitting against the interior wall of the longhouse is yellowing. His skin has been changing color for 3 weeks now, shifting from its normal tone toward a deep, unmistakable ochre, and his eyes, when the firelight catches them, are the color of old amber throughout. sclera and iris both overtaken by the pigment building in his bloodstream. He is 25 years old, heavily built, a craftsman of some local skill, and he is exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with work. A bone-deep, cellular exhaustion that arrives each morning heavier than it was the night before. His urine has darkened to the color of strong tea. His abdomen is tender on the right side, just below the rib cage, where the swollen liver presses outward against the body wall. The people around him recognize the yellowing. They have seen it before in others, and their understanding of what it means is roughly correct in its prognosis and completely wrong in its mechanism, because the mechanism will not be discovered for another 48 centuries. What is happening inside this man's liver is a war of extraordinary complexity. A war between billions of copies of a virus so exquisitely adapted to the human hepatocyte that modern virologists describe its architecture with something approaching reluctant awe, and the immune system that has detected the invasion and launched a counteroffensive so aggressive it is destroying the liver in the process of trying to save it.
A wild Surskit appears
The
captured
paradigm
using
across
poke
all of
catch.
human
Winners
history
revealed in
until the
90s.
mid-20th century was that jaundice was a symptom, not a disease, a sign of liver malfunction arising from any number of causes: bile duct obstruction, poisoning, the insults of hard labor and harder living. The idea that a specific virus could target only the liver, replicate inside hepatocytes with devastating efficiency, evade immune detection for decades in a chronic carrier state, and cause liver cancer 30 years after an infection that produced no symptoms whatsoever. That idea was so far beyond any conceptual framework available to medicine before 1965 that it barely registers as the same category of knowledge. This man in the Bavarian longhouse will be dead within the year. His liver architecture dissolved by inflammatory fibrosis, and the virus that killed him